Chapter 7:18. Within the river of nothingness, there were 12,960,000 square meters of illusory world. Shockingly, they were the places that Luo Fan had specially opened up to help the Khanate gods improve their Tao heart. Text first. Ever since these illusory worlds were created, they had been created to temper the minds of the living beings that could enter them. Therefore, they possessed an unimaginable and wonderful power that could be used on all the minds that were immersed in them, causing them to completely forget all their memories, leaving only the most fundamental essence of their minds to condense into illusory avatars. They would sink into one illusory world after another until they could see through the illusory world they were in and find themselves. Only then would they be able to transcend these illusory worlds and possess a corresponding Tao heart. Luo Fu had used this characteristic of the illusory world to help the perfected immortal resist the endless psychological pressure. The perfected immortal was suffering from the pressure that came from the combination of the boundless essence of the stars that possessed all sorts of characteristics, resulting in some incredible change. Under such circumstances, the best way to avoid this kind of pressure was naturally to completely confuse the perfected immortal's understanding of himself, so that his mind would no longer be a mind. In this way, no matter how strong the pressure was, it would no longer have any effect on him. And the illusory world was the best solution for this kind of problem. In addition, the perfected immortal had triggered the opportunity for Guangpu to break through to the earthly immortal realm and attain Tai fruit of the way. Allowing his mind to enter the illusory world was also a kind of opportunity for the perfected immortal, and it was enough to repay him for triggering Guangpu's opportunity. It was for these various reasons that Luo Fu had imparted the method to the perfected immortal. This was also why he had previously said that he wanted to see what the perfected immortal's opportunity was like. Just as the perfected immortal's mind entered the illusory world and then entered the illusory world to temper his Tao heart, in the bright realm, the tribulation clouds that Guangpu had drawn from attaining Tai fruit of the way had already accumulated to the extreme. They completely enveloped the entire sky of the bright realm, causing the entire bright realm to become almost completely dark except for the light emitted by some glowing objects below. An indescribable pressure came crashing down, enveloping all matter and all living beings in the bright realm. Among them, the pressure was concentrated on Guangpu, who was in the center of the bright realm. After all, the tribulation clouds had come because of Guangpu, so its target was naturally Guangpu. The reason why Luo Fu and the others were oppressed was because they were too close to Guangpu. Luo Fu had already attained the primordial unity scatter, so the tribulation of seeking the primordial unity Tao fruit was nothing to him. He just concentrated his mind and naturally expelled the oppressive force. However, while he could do this, Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua, who were beside him, could not be so relaxed. In fact, the pressure seemed to have exceeded the limits of what they could endure, causing them to feel as if their bodies were bearing the weight of hundreds of millions of mountains. They could not even tremble. And this was just the aftershock of the pressure. One must know that the aftershock they were enduring was not even a millionth of the pressure Guangpu was enduring. Luo Fu's reaction was incomparably fast. In an instant, he discovered that the two of them were acting strangely. With a single thought, he understood what was going on. He sighed and grabbed the two of them, one in each hand. With a single thought, he took a step forward and directly crossed through the void, arriving at the edge of the bright realm. This place was still within the bright realm, and was still enveloped by the tribulation cloud. However, it was already at the edge of the tribulation clouds, and could be considered to have escaped its shroud. In this place, the three of them naturally still had to endure the pressure from the tribulation clouds, but compared to when they were in the center, the pressure was tens of thousands of times smaller. However, such pressure had already weakened to the limits of what Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua could endure. Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua were doing their best to resist the pressure that was about to completely crush them into powder, when their surroundings suddenly changed. The world in front of them had completely changed, and the pressure had also weakened to a level that they could endure. They could not help but be slightly stunned. However, they were only stunned for a moment. They were golden immortals at the end of the day, and they were golden immortals that cultivated in the Tao fruit Grand Tao. At such a level, their minds and the cultivation of their Tao hearts had already reached a rather high level. Under such circumstances, they naturally understood what was going on very quickly, and they couldn't help but reveal ashamed expressions. It's all because our cultivation is too weak, or else we would be able to help Mother pass through the heavenly tribulation, Luogwa sighed. Yes, if there's someone to help, it should be easier to pass through the heavenly tribulation. Luo Chunyang also sighed. When their words reached Luo Fu's ears, Luo Fu could not help but smile. He shook his head and said, "You two are confused because you're too concerned. The heavenly tribulation is a tribulation that the world specifically targets cultivators. If there's someone to help, the power of the tribulation will probably skyrocket by several times. If you help, you'll harm your mother instead." Ah! Luo Chunyang and Luogwa could not help but cry out in surprise. They should be very clear about this kind of common sense, but just as Luo Fu said, they were too concerned because the one undergoing the heavenly tribulation was their dearest mother. Therefore, they did not think clearly about this for a while, and only instinctively wanted to help their mother through the heavenly tribulation. Now that Luo Fu mentioned it, they finally remembered the whole common sense, and could not help but feel slightly afraid. "Father, why aren't you worried about Mother?" After the exclamation, Luogwa could not help but ask when she saw that Luo Fu was actually still in the mood to smile. Luo Fu smiled again and said, "Of course I'm worried, but I know your mother's strength better. You should know that your mother has stepped into the peak of the golden immortal realm for a longer time than me. After such a long time, she has already consolidated all her foundation. As long as the Tai scattered number exists in this world, your mother will definitely be able to pass through the heavenly tribulation." Luo Fu's words were very calm, but the heroic spirit contained in them filled the world. As long as the Tai scattered number existed in this world, Guang Pu would definitely be able to pass through the heavenly tribulation. How confident was he? He clearly believed that Guang Pu's divine ability was the most powerful of all the golden immortals since ancient times. As long as a golden immortal could pass through the heavenly tribulation, then Guang Pu would definitely be able to. Although Luo Chunyang and Luogwa were still worried after hearing Luo Fu's words, they were much more relaxed than before. They could also force a smile on their faces. At this moment, the tribulation clouds suddenly shook, and the entire space of the bright realm trembled slightly. The world in front of Luo Fu and the others seemed to become illusory in an instant. Everything and the landscape changed slightly in that instant. Although the bright realm was already a medium-class world, it was already set when Luo Fan first opened it, so the size of the bright realm was not much different from before. It was still only tens of millions of miles in radius. Tens of millions of miles might be an unimaginable distance for mortals, but for golden immortals like Luo Fu and the others who had the Tai scattered number, this distance was not enough to obstruct their line of sight. As a result, they stood at the edge of the bright realm at all times, at the edge of the tribulation clouds, but each of them could see Guang Pu in the distance. It was just that Luo Fu could see her more clearly, while Luo Chunyang and Luogwa could only vaguely see her. But at this moment the space and time shook, and the distance seemed to be instantly stretched 100 times, 1,000 times. In a trance, Guang Pu's figure directly disappeared from Luo Chunyang and Luogwa's eyes. Even Luo Fu felt that Guang Pu's figure seemed to have shrunk 1,000 times, becoming blurry and indistinct, almost leaving only a shadow. The change was so mysterious that even Luo Fu, who had absolute confidence in Guang Pu, could not help but frown slightly. Although he was still full of confidence, he also began to sigh at the mystery of the tribulation. In the eyes of Luo Fu and the others, the area covered by the tribulation clouds had undergone such a change. In the center of the tribulation clouds, at the core of their oppression, the pressure that Guang Pu had to endure had skyrocketed 100 times in an instant. The space and time around her gradually became chaotic under the influence of an indescribable force. In the chaos of space and time, a shocking tearing force appeared out of thin air and acted directly on Guang Pu, tearing every minute part of Guang Pu's body in all directions. The strength of this force had reached an unimaginable level. Even Guang Pu's body, which had undergone countless tempering and had almost reached the level of primordial immortal, felt as if her whole body was about to be torn into countless pieces and turned into powder under the tearing force. Guang Pu's mind turned, and a look of realization appeared in her eyes. So that's how it is. The primordial tribulation is indeed very different from the earthly immortal tribulation. The earthly immortal tribulation is still at the level of tangible force, but the primordial tribulation has already entered the realm of intangible force. Unlike Luo Fan, who became an earthly immortal in one step, Guang Pu had experienced several heavenly tribulations before she broke through the shackles, and almost exhausted all her efforts to finally attain the earthly immortal Tao fruit. Therefore, she had a deep understanding of the earthly immortal tribulation of attaining the earthly immortal Tao fruit. Therefore, when the primordial tribulation of attaining the earthly immortal Tao fruit broke out, she instinctively compared it with the earthly immortal tribulation. The earthly immortal tribulation had countless forms, such as the 9 freedom divine thunder, the Ewood divine thunder, the real fire of the sun, the evil fire of annihilation, the golden saber of annihilation, the giant capsule divine wind. There were all kinds of them, and each of them was enough to almost kill a cultivator who wanted to attain the earthly immortal Tao fruit. But no matter what form it took, the earthly immortal tribulation still belonged to the category of tangible force, which was similar to the 5 elements of yin and yang, thunder, fire, wind, and evil spirit. Although this kind of tangible force was unparalleled, it was, after all, traceable. It could deal with these tribulations by relying on the principles of mutual restraint, and could make the tribulations less threatening to the cultivator because of the different methods chosen. But this time, the primordial tribulation was completely different from the earthly immortal tribulation. This time, the primordial tribulation had been raised to the level of intangible force. Intangible force may not necessarily be higher than tangible force in essence, but compared with tangible force, it had become traceless. One could only rely on one's own cultivation, one's own physical body, and one's own strength to resist it. It could not be like dealing with tangible force, where one could weaken the influence of the tribulation on the cultivator through various methods. This kind of change was already an extremely serious threat to the cultivator. What's more, the primordial tribulation was, after all, a tribulation that the cultivator would encounter when seeking the Tai Dao fruit. Its intensity was naturally far from the earthly immortal Tao fruit that the cultivator would encounter when seeking the earthly immortal Tao fruit. Its intensity itself was tens of thousands of times stronger than the earthly immortal tribulation. The combination of such changes was enough to make the threat of the primordial tribulation to the cultivator countless times stronger than the earthly immortal tribulation. After slightly comparing the difference between the primordial tribulation and the earthly immortal tribulation, Guang Pu completely put all these distracting thoughts behind her. At this time, she was, after all, going through the tribulation. No matter how confident she was, she could not be distracted. Instead, she needed to concentrate all her attention and use her best efforts to deal with this tribulation. With just a thought, the transcendence power in her body that was in the process of metamorphosis shook slightly. It flowed ceaselessly in her body according to an extremely mysterious path, giving birth to all kinds of wonderful changes. It caused her body to suddenly be enveloped by an indescribable power. This force increased her body's ability to withstand the tearing force by many times. Even though the tearing force was extremely powerful and terrifying, it was no longer able to shake her body. Instead, the impurities within her body were constantly being torn out, causing her body to become purer and stronger during this process. Because the surrounding time and space had been distorted, the flow of time where Guang Pu was also became chaotic. This chaos was not enough to make Guang Pu lose her mind, but it made Guang Pu unable to clearly grasp how much time had passed. It seemed like a few minutes, but it also seemed like several days had passed. Suddenly, another invisible force acted on Guang Pu's body. This force seemed to seep directly out of the void, acting on Guang Pu's body indiscriminately. Under this force, Guang Pu only felt as if her body was being burned hundreds of millions of times more intense than the real fire of the sun. The incomparably scorching feeling drowned her indiscriminately. In this scorching feeling, she even had the thought that if she did not move, her whole body would be burned into nothingness in an instant. This invisible force was completely untraceable, acting directly on every part of her body indiscriminately. Although it made people feel as if their whole body was being burned like a flame, and although it felt as if they could be vaporized and disappear, Guang Pu knew very well that this was not a flame at all. It was not even an invisible flame. If this force was resisted with cold energy, it would not have any effect at all. It might even cause her body to suffer a second injury from the cold energy, which would make her suffer even more serious. Guang Pu had long understood the nature of this Tai tribulation, so why would she still use cold energy to resist this invisible force? With a slight thought, the flow of the magic power in her body changed again, and her magic power underwent another subtle change. This change made her body's endurance to the force that seemed to be burning her body skyrocket. Under this explosive increase in endurance, although her body still felt the incomparably scorching sensation, she still felt as if her body was being incessantly burned and vaporized, but she no longer suffered any real injuries. On the contrary, even more impurities in her body were being burned and vaporized by this invisible power, disappearing into her body, making her body even purer and more powerful. At the same time, she was closer to the level of Tai. After an unknown amount of time, which seemed like a few minutes, but also like a few days, another invisible force appeared out of thin air and acted on her body. This force was completely different from the one before, but it made her feel as if her whole body was frozen and solidified. It was as if all the vitality in her body had been stagnated by this cold energy, and she felt as if she was about to become a lifeless block of ice. This feeling combined with the scorching and tearing sensation from before, and the discomfort skyrocketed by hundreds of times. Luckily, Guang Pu already had experience and did not hesitate in the slightest. The circulation method of the Fa Li in his body once again changed. Similarly, there was an indescribable and subtle change, causing his body's endurance towards the chill to increase exponentially. Magic power was an extremely mysterious talisman. In the great Tao of fruit, it was second only to the divine soul and Tao fruit, and was the absolute core. This kind of core contained everything, possessed boundless might, and contained countless possibilities. Almost as long as you want the power, you can use all kinds of methods to add it to the magic power. And Guang Pu's cultivation of the great Tao of fruit had almost reached the peak of the golden immortal realm. It could even be said that even Hong Jun and Luo Fan might not be able to surpass her when they were in this realm. Therefore, her understanding and control of magic power had reached an indescribable height. It was precisely because of this that every time she was attacked by an invisible force, she could change the flow of magic power to give it some kind of magical power, thus allowing her to resist the damage of the invisible force. Such power, to a certain extent, had almost reached the limit of the golden immortal realm. With her magical power, if the Tai tribulation was only this, it would not be difficult for her to pass through it. Luo Fu's infinite confidence in her was not without reason. The following heavenly tribulations didn't seem to have any intention of increasing the difficulty. They continued to come wave after wave, containing all sorts of strange powers and formless powers inside and outside of Guang Pu's body. Every once in a while, she would need to defend against another type of power. At the same time, it also caused the different types of powers that were added to her magic power to increase, causing the power of her magic power to become stronger and stronger. It also made her body more and more pure and powerful in the process, closer and closer to the primordial realm. Just when Guang Pu even felt that the Tai tribulation was about to pass, the heavenly tribulation underwent a huge change. Q. Chapter 719. Several days after the entire bright world was enveloped by the tribulation clouds, the clouds in the sky suddenly underwent an extremely sinister change. Text first. The space and time that had been distorted by the tribulation clouds in the bright world instantly shuddered, and the degree of distortion increased exponentially. It turned out that Luo Fu could already vaguely see through the distorted space and time to Guang Pu, who was suppressed by the tribulation at the core of the tribulation. But after the distortion, his eyes were instantly covered by a thick layer of fog. It was as if his eyesight had completely lost its effect in the bright world, and his senses were no longer able to allow him to surpass ordinary people. Luo Fu was alarmed when he saw this change. No matter how much confidence he had in Guang Pu, he could no longer maintain his composure. He furrowed his brows, and the light in his eyes narrowed slightly. His aura also became slightly unstable. He had originally thought that no matter how powerful the tribulation one would encounter when seeking Tai Dao fruit was, it would not reach a level that someone like him, who had attained Tai Dao fruit and achieved Tai Loose number, could not withstand. After all, if even someone with Tai Loose number could not withstand it, then the Tai tribulation was not a tribulation, but divine punishment. Because of this, he was able to have such strong confidence in Guang Pu. But now, the situation was different. Although he still had confidence in Guang Pu, he discovered that at this moment, the power of this heavenly tribulation had actually exceeded his imagination. It seemed to be a faint threat to him. How could he not worry about Guang Pu? Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo naturally noticed the change in Luo Fu. When the tribulation erupted, they had already lost the ability to see Guang Pu. Their understanding of the tribulation could only be deduced from their father's performance. In the past few days, Luo Fu had been extremely confident. His expression and aura had not changed at all. This made them understand that Guang Pu's tribulation would be extremely smooth, so they were very relieved. However, at this moment, they suddenly discovered that Luo Fu's expression had changed. The expression in his eyes was grave, and even the aura on his body showed faint signs of instability. How could they not understand that the situation had changed? They could not help but panic. They wanted to stop Luo Fu and ask him about it, but they were afraid that they would affect Luo Fu and cause their father's help to go down the drain. Thus, they could only endure and wait anxiously. Due to this change in mentality, their auras also fluctuated, becoming unstable like Luo Fu. Luo Fu's mental senses were extremely sharp, so he noticed the changes in his children with just a thought. He knew what was going on with a single thought. He hurriedly withdrew his aura and recovered his composure. He said to the two of them, "Don't worry. It's just that the tribulation has changed a little, but it shouldn't stump your mother." Luo Fu's voice was filled with calmness, containing a comforting power. Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo felt their minds clear up, and they were much less anxious. However, they naturally could not completely disappear. Their expressions were still extremely solemn, and they only nodded. However, Luo Fu no longer cared about the two of them. He turned his gaze back to the tribulation clouds in front of him, trying his best to sense every single change in them. Since he could not see Guang Pu clearly in the tribulation clouds, he could only use the changes in the tribulation clouds to deduce how Guang Pu's tribulation was. With Luo Fu's abilities, although this method was not as direct as seeing Guang Pu's figure in the tribulation, it was enough for him to have a rough grasp of the entire process. The changes in the tribulation clouds were extremely intense. The distortions in space-time intensified by who knows how many times. The time, space, matter, and energy in the entire light realm all mixed together under these distortions, forming a gray fog. It directly covered all light in the outside world, as well as all prying eyes. After this change, Guang Pu felt as if the entire spacetime she was in had undergone an earth-shattering change. It was as if she had been teleported to another spacetime in an instant, a spacetime that was extremely chaotic and seemed to have some characteristics of chaos. Due to the chaos of time and space, this spacetime no longer had the concept of size, nor did it have the concept of speed. Even the concept of matter and energy had completely disappeared. When these changes appeared, the countless invisible powers that were born from the void instantly increased by more than 10,000 times. The degree of this increase was extremely shocking. It directly broke through an unbelievable barrier, causing the nature of each invisible power to undergo a subtle change. The result of this subtle change was that the countless invisible powers intertwined and fused together in an instant, producing an unbelievable change. The quality of these countless invisible forces covered all aspects. Almost all the rules and laws in the primordial world were included in them. All the powers intertwined and fused together, instantly forming an existence that was thousands of times more powerful and mysterious than any other invisible power. It was a brand new invisible power that almost contained the entire primordial world. This invisible power contained the characteristics of each invisible power from before, and it had also sublimated countless times on the basis of these characteristics. This made every characteristic that Guang Pu had blocked break through Guang Pu's obstruction in an instant, causing Guang Pu to feel as if she was enduring the negative feelings produced by the countless invisible powers from before. It was as if all her mind, spirit, body, dharma power, and even the fruit of Wei that was in the process of transformation were about to turn into nothingness and become invisible. This feeling was so strong that Guang Pu did not have the slightest doubt in his heart. He clearly knew that if he was unable to resist this invisible force, then what awaited him would definitely be turning into nothingness. Turning into nothingness, and in the end, he would die and his soul would scatter. Although Guang Pu's dharma power was mysterious and all-encompassing, it had its limits after all. It was impossible for it to improve endlessly and change endlessly. The attack of resisting the countless invisible powers from before had almost reached the limit of the changes of the Dharma power. It had exhausted all of Guang Pu's cultivation achievements over the countless years. Under such circumstances, this new change was tantamount to a calamity for her. In an instant, Guang Pu's entire body became illusory and transparent. It was as if she had been injured by the invisible power in that instant and had almost completely disappeared. From this, it could be seen that the current situation was extremely dangerous. Almost in the next instant, her breakthrough would completely fail, and she would die along with it, as if her soul would scatter into nothingness. But even in such a dangerous situation, Guang Pu still did not panic at all. Her mind was completely focused, and she was not shaken at all by the impending death. Specks of wisdom flickered wildly in her mind. Countless thoughts were born and destroyed in every moment. Every moment, she felt that her cultivation realm was leaping towards an unbelievable peak. At this moment, the state of her body was becoming clearer and clearer. Even at this moment, she still had endless confidence in her heart. She was confident that she could definitely survive this Tai tribulation and truly attain the Tai fruit of Wei. This confidence was not something she was born with, but something she had accumulated over countless years of cultivation. It was a confidence she had developed after she had a sufficient understanding of her own strength and her own cultivation. This confidence made her not have the slightest doubt about attaining the Tai fruit of Wei. She also believed that as long as the realm of Tai fruit of Wei existed, as long as a golden immortal could attain it, then she would definitely be able to attain the Tai fruit of Wei, and would never die in this Tai tribulation. This understanding allowed her to remain clear-headed at all times. Even in the most critical moment, she could still think of various countermeasures with a clear mind, instead of losing confidence and waiting for death like other cultivators. The Tai tribulation is formed by heaven and earth to test whether a cultivator is qualified to attain the Tai fruit of Wei. In other words, no matter how strong this tribulation is, as long as I have the power of Tai, I can definitely withstand it. At this moment, this invisible power seems unstoppable, but as long as I can exert the power of Tai, I will definitely be fine. This thought flashed across Guang Pu's mind. With this thought in mind, she no longer hesitated. The magic power in her body that was working hard to resist the invisible power suddenly relaxed and retracted, completely giving up on resisting the invisible power. It rushed down to her lower abdomen, and in the blink of an eye, it condensed into a rapidly changing fruit of Wei in her lower abdomen. This fruit of Wei was constantly twisting and changing, collapsing and recombining billions of times at every moment, as if it was trying hard to reform into an even more mysterious and incredible form, condensing power that was tens of thousands of times stronger than before. As her magic power no longer resisted the invisible power, the destructive power of the invisible power skyrocketed by countless times. In the blink of an eye, Guang Pu's entire body was directly disintegrated by the invisible power, turning into nothingness and disappearing into nothingness, as if she had never been there. However, even so, the tribulation clouds in the sky did not disappear. Instead, they became denser, and the space-time distortions in the bright realm became even more intense, causing the gray smoke in front of Luo Fu and the others in the outside world to become even denser, as if it wanted to turn the entire bright realm into a state of chaos. It was very clear that although her body had become invisible and turned into nothingness, Guang Pu still did not die, and still did not truly fail the tribulation. At this moment, Guang Pu was in an extremely mysterious state. Her body, her spirit, and everything about her seemed to have completely disappeared. However, she could still feel their existence in her senses, as if they had just transformed into another state that could not be seen or sensed. This feeling was so wonderful that she instantly knew that there was nothing wrong with her way of dealing with the heavenly tribulation just now. However, this did not mean that the way she dealt with the heavenly tribulation from the beginning was wrong. It did not mean that she could completely ignore the invasion of the invisible power and turn into nothingness when the heavenly tribulation erupted at the very beginning. In reality, if she had not resisted the countless invisible powers over the past few days, if she had not worked hard during the heavenly tribulation to transform her magic power and evolve her fruits of Wei, and if she had given up on resisting the invasion of the invisible power, what awaited her would definitely have been death, and her spirit would have scattered. She would not have been in such an extremely mysterious state. The reason why she could be in such an extremely mysterious state was very simple. It was because during the heavenly tribulation, her magic power, her fruits of Wei, and even her body, her spirit, and everything inside and outside of her body had unknowingly gotten used to the invisible power, and they now possessed some sort of power that was similar to the invisible power. This kind of power was not enough to turn her into an invisible force, but it was enough to allow her to maintain a bit of her most core and most fundamental life essence under the invasion and destruction of the invisible force. As a result, she was able to remain in this mysterious state at this moment. Of course, she could not turn into an invisible power after all. As a result, she could not stay in this state for too long. It could only be a relatively short period of time. If she could not think of a way to break out of this state after a long time and resist the invisible power that seemed to encompass the entire primordial world, what awaited her would still be death, her spirit would still scatter, and she would still fail the heavenly tribulation and disappear from the world. Guangpu was extremely clear about this. Naturally, she would not waste any time. She focused all of her attention on her transforming fruit of Wei. As she immersed herself in it, it was as if she had instantly become the fruit of Tao. She could clearly sense the slightest transformation of the fruit of Tao, and she could directly sense the endless mysteries contained within the fruit of Tao. Even though she had cultivated this fruit of Wei's, and it was the result of her lifetime of cultivation, the source was still Luo Fan's legacy. As a result, there were many mysteries within it that she could not understand. It was something that she would need to spend a long time to comprehend and grasp. In that instant, Guangpu felt as if she had entered an incomparably vast and deep world. It was as if the entire universe was displayed in front of her, and everything in this universe was so familiar to her, yet so foreign. She was not only in awe, but also in awe at the same time. What was familiar was the structure of the universe. Everything in the universe seemed to have been condensed according to her countless years of cultivation. Wherever she looked, she could vaguely connect it to a certain part of her cultivation. What was strange was that although these scenes were familiar, she could not grasp their essence. It was as if behind these incomparably familiar appearances were hidden deeper and more inconceivable mysteries, and these mysteries were the very truths that she had been trying her best to obtain, exhausting everything she had to prove, but she still could not prove them. At that moment, Guangpu felt indescribably moved from the bottom of her heart. "I've finally reached this step." This thought instantly occupied her mind, filling her heart with an indescribable joy. She could sense the deeper, more unbelievable truths hidden behind the appearances. This meant that she was already close to the origin of the great way of Wei. It meant that she was finally about to truly come into contact with the truth of cultivation that her master had taught her. It also meant that she was about to set foot on her own great way and complete her own path. How could she not dare to move? How could she not be happy? Amidst her joy, Guangpu released her understanding of Tai, as well as the various understandings she had gained in the past few days. She kept combining them with her own fruit of Tao, causing her fruit of Tao to gradually evolve in a certain direction, even though it was undergoing billions of metamorphoses at every moment. The speed of this evolution was extremely fast. In a trance, she had reached the limit. She had finally reached a state where the primordial unity she had gained, as well as the various insights she had gained over the past few days, had completely fused with her fruit of Wei. At that moment, her fruit of Wei finally trembled and stabilized in an extremely mysterious state. This state of the fruit of Wei was completely different from before. It gave off the aura of primordial unity. The fruit of Wei did not emit any light, but it gave off a feeling of endless silver brilliance. It seemed to directly affect the perception of all living beings who saw the fruit of Wei, making them feel as if they were bathing in the essence of the moon. The shape of the entire Tao fruit was extremely mysterious, and it was impossible to describe it with a specific shape. In fact, anyone who saw this fruit would instantly forget any description of its shape. They would only know that it was a fruit, a mysterious primordial unity Tao fruit that contained boundless and inconceivable power. After the fruit of primordial unity stabilized, Guangpu felt that her state of mind was rising to an incredible level. In the blink of an eye, she had reached a state that was beyond imagination. In a trance, she felt that heaven and earth were no longer mysterious in her eyes. It was as if she could completely break and destroy the bright realm with just a slight tremble. Even the invisible force that she had been completely unable to resist before, which was formed by the combination of all the invisible forces, seemed to have become extremely fragile at that moment, as if she could easily resist it. As soon as this feeling appeared, Guangpu could not help but be filled with indescribable joy. So this is the primordial unity loose number. After cultivating for hundreds of millions of years and exhausting all my mental energy, I have finally attained this primordial unity fruit of Wei. A long and leisurely sigh of joy rang out from the void. Chapter 720. With this long sigh, a figure materialized out of nothingness. Text first. It was the figure of a woman, beautiful and voluptuous. She exuded an extremely mysterious aura, as if she was surrounded by an invisible force that could not be described with words. This woman was, of course, Guangpu. This body was formed directly after she attained the primordial Tao fruit, a mystical body that had completely reached the level of primordial immortals. At this moment, she floated in midair. The space-time around her was still severely distorted, and the invisible force that was enough to completely destroy her original body and even kill her was still there. But all of this was like an illusion to her. For Luo Fu, the Tai tribulation was so powerful that he could not face it calmly. He was even a little worried about whether Guangpu could survive it. Such a difference did not mean that Guangpu, who had attained Tai Dao fruit, was stronger than Luo Fu, who had attained Tai Dao fruit long ago. It only meant that Guangpu had a stronger resistance to the invisible force than Luo Fu, and had a higher endurance. In other aspects, Guangpu was not necessarily better than Luo Fu. On the contrary, she was much weaker than Luo Fu in other aspects. The reason why Guangpu had such an ability that Luo Fu did not have was that Guangpu had to overcome the Tai tribulation to attain Tai Dao fruit, while Luo Fu attained Tai Dao fruit naturally. This difference resulted in this difference. The Tai tribulation was the greatest danger for cultivators who wanted to attain Tai Dao fruit, but at the same time, it was also their greatest opportunity. If they could not overcome the Tai tribulation, then there was naturally no need to talk about it. They would die, their Tao would vanish, and their souls would scatter. If a cultivator could overcome the Tai tribulation, they would naturally obtain unimaginable benefit. Not only would he be able to obtain the most powerful primordial unity Tao fruit, but he would also be able to gain incredible resistance and control over invisible forces during this process. At this moment, Guangpu possessed a power that Luo Fu did not possess. Of course, this did not mean that not passing the Tai tribulation meant that attaining the Tai Dao fruit was inferior to passing the Tai tribulation. To be able to attain the Tai Dao fruit without the need to trigger the Tai tribulation, the Tai Dao fruit itself already possessed countless divine powers that surpassed ordinary cultivators. Even if it lacked the super-strong resistance and control to the invisible force, it was still nothing much. In fact, it wasn't an irreparable loss. For example, if Luo Fu wanted to possess this kind of power, he only needed to let Guangpu offer many invisible forces for him to comprehend and integrate them into his own magic power. At this moment, the tribulation clouds that enveloped the entire Ming realm began to twist and tremble violently. The inconceivable power contained within the clouds began to crazily press downward. During this process, it transformed into more and more formless power. Through some mysterious transformation, it appeared out of thin air, directly affecting Guangpu's entire body. This change caused the invisible force that was originally enough to turn Guangpu invisible and into nothingness to increase exponentially. If the main body of its effect was dispersed, it would probably be enough to completely disintegrate the entire bright realm and return it to nothingness. However, such a terrifying invisible force only exerted a little pressure on Guangpu. Her body trembled slightly under the invisible power, and strands of strange matter disappeared from her body. Her body continued to improve, becoming more and more refined. But she did not reject the invisible force. Instead, she used it to constantly temper the Tai body that she had just condensed. This body was condensed completely according to the supreme power contained in her Tao fruit after the complete transformation. It was completely capable of withstanding the Tai Dao fruit and the magic power of the Tai level flowing in it. Its strength was thousands of times stronger than before she achieved the Tai loose number. But after all, this was only a newly condensed body. Although it was already a Tai body, it had not reached the limit of this body. There was still a lot of room for improvement. Without the invisible force, she would have to spend endless energy to condense all kinds of forces to temper this body in the future, so that it could truly reach the limit and the peak. At this moment, with that invisible power, she could save a lot of energy. Her Tai Dao fruit was condensed according to the invisible force and the various mysteries of Tai that she had comprehended, so it naturally contained the essence of the mysteries of Tai and the invisible force. Under such circumstances, her ability to withstand the invisible force had reached an unimaginable level. Although the invisible force was many times stronger than before, it could not change her essence. No matter how strong it was, it could only strengthen the tempering of her body, but it could not really erase her completely. In this kind of situation, Guangpu naturally would not waste the opportunity. He only quietly waited for the invisible power to attack him. He did not try to destroy the tribulation clouds, nor did he use the extremely powerful control over the invisible power that he had obtained after attaining Tai disintegration to resist the invisible power. This wave of invisible force was clearly the last attack of the Tai tribulation. As long as she withstood this attack, the tribulation would pass, and the entire Ming realm would return to how it was before the tribulation, as if nothing had ever happened. Within the Tai tribulation, Guangpu was extremely calm as she withstood the attacks of the invisible force, but outside the tribulation clouds, Luo Fu and the others could no longer remain calm. This was because the moment the tribulation clouds changed, the entire area enveloped by the tribulation clouds became even more terrifying and astonishing. In an instant, the layer of gray mist that blocked Luo Fu's vision suddenly increased by 10,000 times. Originally, he could vaguely see the scene of the Ming realm behind the mist, but now all he could see was gray. It was as if the entire area enveloped by the tribulation clouds had completely returned to a state of chaos. The distortion of space-time had reached a state where it had almost completely destroyed space-time, completely distorting all senses that dared to penetrate it. Even if Luo Fu tried to forcibly use his superb senses to sense the scene inside, he would not be able to do so. Even the aura of annihilation from the tribulation clouds had increased by many times during this process. Even Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo trembled as fear appeared in their eyes. How could such a change be normal? How could Luo Fu and the others not be worried? Fortunately, Luo Fu was still rational after all. He knew that the more intense the changes in the tribulation clouds, the more powerful Guangpu's resistance was. As long as the tribulation clouds did not disappear, it meant that Guangpu had not failed or succeeded in her tribulation. Therefore, although the changes were intense and he was worried, he did not really lose confidence. Instead, he still kept a little bit of consciousness to pay attention to his surroundings. When he saw that Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo were unable to bear the fear, he knew what was going on. He raised his hand, and a gust of primordial energy shot out from his hand, directly turning into a shield to protect them. This gust of primordial energy was very mysterious. It might not be very powerful in itself, but it had a mysterious power that directly transmitted the aura from the heavenly tribulation and completely isolated Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo's mind. It allowed them to instantly regain their senses, and the fear in their eyes completely disappeared. After regaining their senses, they still looked worriedly at the tribulation clouds in front of them. They opened their mouths as if they wanted to ask Luo Fu what was going on, but when they saw Luo Fu's expression, they wisely kept their mouths shut. While the three of them were worrying, the changes in the area enveloped by the tribulation clouds grew more and more intense. In the process, the entire area enveloped by the tribulation clouds did not expand, but kept shrinking. After several hours, the entire tribulation cloud had shrunk to half of its original size. However, the remaining half of the tribulation cloud covered an area that was close to a state of chaos. The degree of spacetime distortion was also several times more intense than before. It seemed as if a world was constantly being destroyed within it. Naturally, Luo Fu and the other two did not hesitate at all. As the tribulation clouds kept receding, they kept moving forward, trying their best to get closer to Guangpu, who was in the center of the tribulation clouds. In the area where the tribulation clouds had receded, everything was as if the tribulation clouds had never appeared. The distortion of space-time, the chaos of energy and matter, and the grayish scene that seemed to be in a state of chaos had never happened. It did not affect these areas at all. What these areas looked like before the tribulation clouds appeared, and what they looked like after the tribulation clouds receded. The earth, the mountains, the rivers, the vegetation, and the living creatures, everything was the same. Even the living creatures could not feel the space-time chaos that had happened before. The entire world had almost returned to a state of chaos. They were still moving leisurely on the earth and in the void, just like before the tribulation clouds had arrived. All these changes were extremely mysterious and contained some kind of supreme truth. Under normal circumstances, Luo Fu and the others would definitely not let it go. But at this moment they were only concerned about Guangpu, who was enveloped by the tribulation clouds. None of them paid any attention to these things at all. This kind of time was incomparably difficult to endure. After a few hours, when the tribulation clouds shrunk to a radius of a few dozen feet, Luo Fu and the others felt as if tens of thousands of years had passed. At this moment, the three of them already knew that the final moment had probably arrived. Would Guangpu survive the Tai tribulation, or would the Tai tribulation obliterate Guangpu? The outcome would soon be revealed. At this moment, the three of them had solemn expressions on their faces as they stared at the gray Mengmeng area in front of them. Just as the few of them were feeling extremely nervous, the gray area of Mengmeng suddenly trembled slightly. Then, a deafening thunderclap erupted from it and spread in all directions, causing the entire Ming realm to tremble violently. It was as if a divine dragon that had been sleeping for countless years had suddenly awakened from its slumber. With this tremor, Luo Fu felt that his connection with the Ming realm, which had been severed by the tribulation clouds for several days, had instantly returned. In fact, it had become even closer and more perfect than before. With the return of this connection, he instantly relaxed, and a relaxed smile appeared on his face. He felt that the whole world had become so beautiful. The reason for this was not because he had regained the Ming realm, but because the moment his connection with the Ming realm was re-established, he felt another consciousness that was connected to the Ming realm. It was a consciousness that he was extremely fond of, and it belonged to Guangpu. After feeling this consciousness, he instantly understood the result of the Tai tribulation. He knew that Guangpu had survived the Tai tribulation and finally attained the Tai fruit of Wei, achieving the same Tai loose number as him. It was precisely because of this that he was so relaxed and happy. In a good mood, Luo Fu said to Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua, "It's all right now. Your mother has successfully survived the tribulation and become a Tai." At this moment, Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua's hearts were in turmoil. They did not know what the tremor of the entire Ming realm represented, and they did not know what the changes in the tribulation clouds in front of them meant. When they suddenly heard what Luo Fu said, they could not help but be overjoyed, and the two of them completely relaxed in an instant. As they relaxed, the two of them instantly sweated profusely, and their entire bodies felt much lighter, as if they had completely let go of a stone that had been suppressed in their hearts for many years. It was as if the heavy burden in their hearts had flowed out along with the viscous sweat just now. At this moment, the area enveloped by the chaotic tribulation clouds in front of them suddenly expanded several times. If it were not for Luo Fu's quick reaction, and bringing Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua several hundred feet back, the soaring tribulation clouds would have enveloped the three of them. After the area enveloped by the tribulation clouds expanded to its limit, it suddenly shrank at an even faster speed. In the blink of an eye, it had shrunk to the centermost area, revealing a gray humanoid figure. Then, there was a loud rumble, and a violent tremor came from the figure. The entire Ming realm shook again. Luo Fu only felt that the connection between him and the Ming realm had increased by several times in an instant, and even the entire Ming realm had received considerable benefits in this process. It was as if the vitality had become much denser, and the entire space and time had become much more stable. Following this change, the gray mist on the figure slowly receded, revealing the figure's true appearance. It was naturally Guang Pu. At this moment, Guang Pu's body exuded a faint, mysterious aura. This aura contained unfathomable profoundness, as if it was evolving millions of different types of power, giving off an unfathomable feeling. Guang Pu slowly opened her eyes. Her body trembled a few times, and an unbreakable aura seeped out from her movements. It was as if her body had reached an unimaginable level, and even the endless flow of time would not be able to harm her in the slightest. I've become a Tai Lu sage. I've made you worry, senior brother. Guang Pu looked at Luo Fu softly and said, "It's good that you've succeeded, it's good that you've succeeded. I knew that this Tai tribulation would not be difficult for you, ha ha ha." Luo Fu laughed out loud, but he was so happy that he almost lost his composure. "Congratulations on attaining Tai, mother." Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo were both surprised and delighted. "You two brats!" Guang Pu laughed and scolded them. She grabbed Luo Fu's hand and said, "I've learned a lot from this Tai tribulation. Why don't we preach the Tao to Guo'er and Chunyang?" For Luo Fan, any casual words he said were enough for his disciples to comprehend for a long time. Therefore, every time he gave them guidance, it could be said that he was preaching the Tao. Even after attaining the Zenith Heaven Tao fruit, his every move could be regarded as preaching the Tao to his disciples. But for cultivators at the level of Luo Fu and Guang Pu, preaching the Tao was an extremely serious and solemn matter. If they did not have absolute confidence that what they said was correct and absolutely beneficial to Luo Guo and the others, they would never dare to use the term preaching the Tao to give them guidance. At this moment, Guang Pu dared to use this word, indicating that she had absolute confidence in the various principles that she had comprehended during the Tai tribulation. She was confident that these principles that she had comprehended would be correct even if they were applied to Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo, and would be of great benefit to them. Hearing Guang Pu's words, Luo Fu's eyes were filled with surprise. He took Guang Pu's hand and said, "Junior sister, you actually have such confidence? Senior brother, when have you ever seen me lie?" Guang Pu smiled. "That's great, but I'm afraid this matter has to be pushed back a little. Let's preach to Chunyang and Guo'er after we resolve one matter," Luo Fu said with a smile. "Senior brother, are you talking about the person in front of the Moon Palace?" Guang Pu immediately understood what Luo Fu was talking about and said with a smile. As she spoke, she casually pointed a finger, and a mirror with a diameter of 10 feet appeared in front of the four of them. A shadow appeared on the mirror, and it was shining with silver light. It was the scene of the Moon Palace in front of them. There was an old man sitting cross-legged like a statue. His breathing had almost stopped, and the power in his body was silent, as if he had fallen into the deepest state of meditation. Although he's only a perfected immortal, his cultivation method is extremely exquisite, and his foundation is solid. Although his power is weak, it is very pure and condensed. He can barely be considered a talent. Guang Pu's gaze swept across and he took in everything that was happening inside and outside of the old man's body into his mind. Why did a perfected immortal appear in front of the Moon Palace? At this moment, Luo Guo asked in surprise. Luo Guo and Luo Chunyang did not have a superb grasp of the Ming realm and the sun and moon like Luo Fan and Guang Pu, so they had never known that it was this perfected immortal who had triggered Guang Pu's opportunity, allowing Guang Pu to attain Tai Fruit of Wei. Now that they saw the old man, they were naturally inexplicably shocked. Chapter 721 Volume 6 Age of Destruction Volume Chapter 390 Age of Destruction Age of Destruction Volume Chapter 390 This was because the net's composition was made up of the laws. In other words, in that mysterious state where he could multitask, he could see the laws with his own eyes. How rare was that? After all, cultivators worked hard and expended all their efforts in order to comprehend a tiny bit of the profound effects of a law. Even if they were able to sense a tiny bit of the aura of a law that was practically impossible to detect, it was already enough to make them go mad with joy. If he could see the laws with his own eyes, what could be more wonderful than that? Because of this, he could discover all the mysteries of the laws without any hindrance. Everything was vivid in his mind, clearly presented before his eyes, without any deviation, error, or omission. Anyone, even a saint venerable, would yearn for such a realm. Even if one could see the fluctuations of the great Tao inside the heavenly saint palace, it was only due to the influence of the laws in the outside world. For example, if one threw a stone into the water, one could see ripples on the water surface. The fluctuations of the great Tao were these ripples. However, the true great Tao was the stone that caused the ripples. But this stone was underwater, and one could not see it. Even so, it was much better than the previous state where one could only try to figure it out. Therefore, the heavenly saint palace was a place that every saint venerable wished to stay for a long time. Being able to see the great Tao laws with one's own eyes was many times more wonderful than seeing the fluctuations of the great Tao in the heavenly saint palace. However, Jin Huan, who had personally entered this realm, did not look happy at all. This did not mean that his cultivation had reached a level where he could not be affected by external objects. The reason was that although Jin Huan could see the great Tao laws, he could not understand them. It was like an illiterate looking at English. It was useless to look at it. English was different from Chinese characters. It was not hieroglyphics. With hieroglyphics, one could barely figure out the meaning from the simple characters. For example, one could recognize the word sun as the sun. One could roughly guess that the word man was a person. One could also guess that the word shan was related to a mountain. However, it was impossible to guess the content of an English word from its outer appearance. Still, a true linguist could slowly decipher the words based on their expertise. Even if it was an alphabetic language, it could be deciphered. But he was a linguist. If it was an illiterate person who didn't know any language and would never be able to learn, would he be able to guess the content of the words even if he was given an infinite amount of time? The answer, of course, was no. Jin Huan, who had seen the great Tao laws, was an illiterate who knew nothing and had no way of learning. Therefore, it was impossible for him to comprehend anything from the practitioners of the great Tao. Speaking of which, this was probably a form of torture. The law of the great path that all cultivators yearned for was clearly presented in front of them, but they had no ability to comprehend it, no ability to understand it. How depressing would that be? It was fine if he didn't know. Even though he knew, he couldn't do anything about it. That was truly a form of torture. But now, Jin Huan was in that mysterious state, and he did not feel depressed or anything like that. It was as if the mechanism in his body that produced such emotions had completely disappeared. This situation was quite strange. Jin Huan did not panic. Of course, it could be that he did not know how to panic anymore. Instead, he looked at all the changes with a curious gaze. Complete it later. Chapter 722. Luo Fu smiled and casually explained the reason why the old man had appeared in the Moon Palace. When he heard that the old man had triggered his mother's opportunity to become enlightened, he could not help but feel an inexplicable sense of closeness towards the old man. Words first, very literary as soon as this feeling of closeness appeared, Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo began to worry whether something would happen to the perfected immortal old man. So much power has gathered over the past few days. Will this person be injured because of this power? Father, you should save him, said Luo Chunyang. There's no need to worry. That person has already entered the illusory world your grandfather created to refine his Tao heart. Nothing that happens in the outside world will truly affect his mind. Luo Fu could not help but smile. Hongxiao book bar. Although he said that, Luo Fu did not just stand there and do nothing. He casually waved his hand and endless lunar essence gathered on the moon towards the perfected, immortal old man. In the blink of an eye, it formed a ball of silver light around the perfected, immortal old man. It gave off an indescribably powerful penetrative power. It seemed to pierce through the sky, through space-time, and directly into the bright realm. As the light flickered, the perfected immortal old man instantly disappeared in front of the Moon Palace. When he reappeared, he was already in the bright realm, in front of Luo Fu and the others. During this process, he wasn't affected in the slightest. Even though he had already arrived in the bright realm and was not directly in the untainted world, his mind could still easily immerse itself in the virtual world. He was not affected at all, and he was still tempering his Taoist heart. As for his body and his celestial core, they were not affected at all. It was as if he had not left the Moon Palace and entered the bright realm himself. Instead, the spacetime he was in had directly moved into the bright realm. This was the reason why Luo Fu had gathered the endless lunar essence and used its power to move into the bright realm. If it was not for the fact that he did not want to affect the perfected immortal's mind and maintain the connection between his mind and the virtual world, why would he need to gather the lunar essence? He only needed to think about it and he would naturally be able to enter the bright realm. However, that would definitely affect the perfected, immortal old man's mind due to the change in spacetime. As a result, all his efforts over the past few days would be for naught. Immersing one's mind into the virtual world to comprehend and endure the tempering of the virtual world was a very personal process. Even though Luo Fu was a Tai Lus cultivator and was billions of times stronger than this true immortal old man, he could not tell how far this true immortal old man had seen through the illusory world and how far his Tao heart had been cultivated. Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo could not help but frown when they saw the perfected immortal old man. Luo Guo immediately asked, "This person has really reached the perfected immortal realm? How can he be so weak? His body's power and the power. Lili realm, what? Yes. Apart from that, this person's aura seems to belong to the acquired realm. The innate aura is extremely thin. It seems that he has obtained immortality, but it is quite difficult," Luo Chunyang added after hearing Luo Guo's words. "You too, don't use our own standards to measure him." At this time, Guangpu smiled. "Exactly. This person is an acquired being, and the primordial qi of heaven and earth is the absolute ruler of the untainted land. The fact that he can cultivate such a power under such circumstances shows that it is extremely pure. It is quite rare for a perfected immortal to have such power," Luo Fu said. Luo Fu and Guangpu had both attained the perfected immortal realm and achieved the perfected immortal realm. Their insight and knowledge had been greatly improved in an instant. At this moment, they already had the demeanor of Luo Fan. Therefore, when they saw the old perfected immortal, the two of them simultaneously understood the old perfected immortal's cultivation situation, cultivation environment, cultivation method, and many other things that could only be known after a deep understanding. Therefore, the two of them did not look down on the old perfected immortal at all. Instead, they rather admired him. The fact that he could cultivate to the perfected immortal realm in such a short time under the circumstances of the untainted land and possess such a pure power compared to the current untainted land showed how strong his willpower was and how stable his cultivation of the Taoist heart was. Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo still did not agree with Luo Fu and Guangpu's explanation, but they did not say anything. They just observed the old perfected immortal in front of them curiously. "Senior brother, this person's temperament is so outstanding. He will definitely achieve great things in the future. Since we don't have any disciples now, why don't we take him as our disciple?" Guangpu said to Luo Fu. Luo Fu was slightly stunned when he heard Guangpu's words. He did not expect Guang Pu to suddenly say that. But in next to no time, he'd clearly considered the merits and demerits of Guang Pu's suggestion, and he nodded and said, "This suggestion isn't bad. Since we attained the earthly immortal Tao fruit that day, Father allowed us to establish our sect, but we still haven't taken any disciples up until now, and it really isn't right. Since this person triggered Junior Sister's breakthrough opportunity, it can be said that he is fated with Junior Sister. Taking him as a disciple is the best of both worlds. Since Senior Brother agrees, then I am relieved." Guang Pu smiled. "However, although this person is suitable to be taken in as a disciple, he is only one person. So Junior Sister, you can take him in as a disciple. I will just be a senior uncle." Luo Fu smiled as well. "That's good too. Although this person is fated with me, it is not enough for both of us to take him as a disciple." Guang Pu nodded. In just a few words, the two of them had decided the fate of the old perfected immortal. Since they had already made their decision, they were naturally not in a hurry to wake the old perfected immortal, and they were not in a hurry to explain Tao to Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo. With just a thought, the two of them disappeared with Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo. They entered the cave that they had originally opened up. Only the old perfected immortal was left there. He was sitting cross-legged with his eyes closed. His aura was calm and quiet, like a wooden statue. In the blink of an eye, several days passed. To Luo Fu and the others, several days were no different from the blink of an eye. They naturally would not feel impatient just because they had waited for a few days. On this day, Guang Pu, who was in the cave, had a thought. She instantly understood that the old perfected immortal was about to wake up. She raised her hand and waved. A projection condensed in front of her, showing the scene of the old perfected immortal and his surroundings. In the projection, the old perfected immortal's body suddenly trembled slightly. Following that, an indescribable aura seeped out of his body. The aura was not powerful. In fact, it was as weak as an ant in the eyes of Luo Fu and the others. However, it was filled with a kind of detachment. It was a detachment that saw through everything and comprehended everything. It was as if there was nothing in the entire universe that could hide from his eyes and senses. Luo Fu and the others could not be more clear about what this mysterious aura represented. This was clearly the aura of someone who had cultivated their Taoist heart to at least the 8th realm. It might even be on the verge of the 9th realm of demonic cultivation. This aura meant that this person's Taoist heart had almost reached perfection. This was a situation that Luo Fu and Guang Pu had barely achieved. In Luo Fan's initial setting, it was only possible for someone who had at least attained primordial unity fruit to achieve this. However, it had appeared above such a weak perfected immortal. This was truly unbelievable. Luo Fu originally did not want to care about the perfected immortal. He planned to leave it to Guang Pu to handle. However, the moment this aura appeared, he could no longer remain calm. His eyes widened and his mouth was agape. There was a look of disbelief in his eyes. How is this possible? To see through all 12,960,000 square feet of virtual heaven and earth, one must at least be at the peak of the golden immortal realm. And to reach the 9th realm of demonic cultivation, one must at least attain primordial unity fruit to be able to see through all the heaven and earth and see through all the structure of the trial heaven and earth. How can this person surpass the limits of cultivation and see through 12,960,000 square feet of virtual heaven and earth at the perfected immortal realm? And it only took such a short time? How is this possible? This thought kept reverberating in Luo Fu's mind. I see. So it was a trial heaven and earth set up by some mighty figure. To be able to achieve this, it seems that I thought that becoming a perfected immortal was already very amazing. I was just a frog at the bottom of a well. The old man let out a long sigh. At this moment, although he was laughing at himself, his expression was calm. The aura around him was as dignified as before. Obviously, his emotions were not shaken at all by this sense of defeat. He slowly stood up and looked around. He found that the world in front of him was no longer the world he was familiar with. Instead, it was a wonderful world that he had never seen before. The stability of the void in this world was far less than that of the untainted world. The stability of time was many times weaker than that of the untainted world. Obviously, this world was much worse than the untainted world. However, this world had a special characteristic that the untainted world could never compare with. That was, the innate chi of primordial world, which only accounted for a very small part of the primordial world's primordial chi, was so dense that it almost condensed into mist. There were even wisps of primordial chi that were of a higher level and more mysterious than the innate chi floating freely among the innate chi. Such a world was extremely blessed by the heavens. If one was born in this world, even if he was born in the morning and died in the evening, he would still be able to live forever. If he was born in this world, how would he still look like an old man? How would his divine power be so weak? Although he had seen a wondrous world that he had never seen before and felt an unprecedented impact, causing thoughts to flash through his mind, the old man's emotions were not thrown into disarray because of this. Although there was amazement on his face, he did not lose his composure at all. Only yearning and regret appeared in his eyes. The 960,000 square meters of virtual world that Luo Fan had set up was created according to the untainted world. Although every world had some changes compared to the untainted world, overall, the shadow of the untainted world could still be seen. Therefore, the old true immortal, who had seen through the 960,000 square meters of virtual world, not only had his Tao heart been indescribably tempered during the trial, but it had also been improved to an unimaginable level, almost reaching perfection. At the same time, he had also learned what the untainted world looked like before the great tribulation of heaven and earth from the virtual world. Under such circumstances, after distinguishing the world in front of him, he realized that this world was created according to the original untainted world. However, although the environment of this world was wonderful, it was still much worse than the original untainted world. After a brief comparison in his mind, the old true immortal bowed to the sky and said, "I'm a junior cultivator, Lao Dan. Thank you for your protection, senior. Please grant me a meeting." "Oh, is your name Lao Dan?" As soon as he finished speaking, a leisurely female voice sounded out of thin air and entered the ears of the old man. The female voice did not contain any power, nor did it trigger any vitality. It did not even arouse a trace of fluctuation, but it had an indescribable sense of mystery. It was as if every syllable of the voice contained an incredible truth, and every word that was uttered contained an amazing mystery. When the voice entered the ears of the old man, he instantly understood that the person who was speaking was far more powerful than him, be it in terms of the realm of cultivation, the power of her supernatural power, or even the cultivation of her Tao heart that had just been unimaginably improved. She had almost reached a level that he could not catch up with. Could it be that the trial world was created by this senior? That should be the case. Only someone as powerful as this senior would be able to open up such an unbelievable trial world. This thought appeared in the old man's mind. The thought only flashed past his mind. However, in the eyes of the outside world, he did not pause at all. He bowed again and said, "I've been old since I was young. My ears are long and big, so I call myself Lao Dan." Old, there was no need to explain. Lao Dan, on the other hand, meant long and big ears. Looking at the pair of earlobes of the white-haired old man, the name Lao Dan was indeed very vivid. This was the only thought that appeared in the minds of Guang Pu, Luo Fu, and the others. However, if Luo Fan paid attention to this, he would know what kind of person Lao Dan was and what an incredible position he had in the myths and legends of the future generations. Lao Dan, commonly known as Laozi, was also known as the Grand Supreme Lord, and was also known as the Tai Ching Tao Lord. He was one of the 6 great sages under Hongjun in the legend. He was the first sage in the primitive world after Hongjun, and one of the 3 great sages transformed from the primordial spirit of Pangu, the head of the 3 pristine ones. Any one of these was enough to amaze people. At this time, the first saint of the wilderness, who was second only to Hongjun in the myths and legends, was respectfully asking Luo Fan's only female disciple to meet him. This contrast was so great that even Luo Fan couldn't help but be shocked. Of course, with Luo Fan being able to treat Hongjun as an ordinary disciple, it was doubtful how strong this kind of shock could be. Guangpu, Luo Fu, and the others did not know about the myths and legends of the future generations. Naturally, they did not think that there was anything wrong with the way this weak real immortal responded. Instead, they were interested in the name of this person. At that moment, Guangpu smiled and waved her hand. The void in front of Lao Dan trembled slightly, and a light door about 30 feet high appeared. The light door was shining with a faint clear light. Like water, it flowed slightly along with the flow of the vitality in the void. The whole process of the light door's appearance did not cause any vibration in space, time, matter, or energy. It was as if it was just a projection of light and shadow. The whole process was silent. Even though Lao Dan had some speculations about the power of the great medium, he was still amazed by such a sudden and natural change. "If you want to see me, just step through the door," said Guangpu. Her voice also passed through the void and entered Lao Dan's ears. Upon hearing this, Lao Dan bowed and said, "Thank you for giving me a meeting, Senior." As soon as he finished speaking, he took a few steps forward and stepped through the door without any hesitation. The clear light emitted by the portal was like flowing water. Lao Dan, who had stepped into the portal, felt that his body had undergone a thorough baptism in the process of passing through the portal. Countless impurities that remained in his body due to his previous cultivation were removed in an instant. After passing through the portal, his body seemed to have returned to the extremely pure state when he was just born. Although there was no improvement in strength, his potential was many times higher than before. This state was so relaxed and wonderful that he could not help but feel a sense of joy from the bottom of his heart. Naturally, a smile appeared on his face. Hongqiao Book Bar with a smile on his face. He raised his head and found that he had traveled through time and space unknowingly. He arrived at a manor and appeared in front of a wooden house. At this moment, a 9th heaven goddess was standing at the door of the wooden house. Although she did not emit any aura, anyone who saw her would feel that she was extremely noble and was the most honorable existence in the world. Without any reason, Lao Dan knew that this person must be the person who spoke just now. He quickly knelt on the ground and said, "Greetings, Senior. Thank you for your protection." Obviously, the woman was Guangpu. When he saw Lao Dan, he was quite satisfied with him. Previously, he wanted to accept Lao Dan as his disciple because he wanted to repay Lao Dan for triggering his chance to attain the Tai Dao fruit. He also wanted to give Lao Dan a chance to attain the Tai Dao fruit. At this moment, when he saw Lao Dan's every move and the cultivation of his Dao heart that was close to the 9th state, he became more and more satisfied. He could not help but have the thought of passing his mantle to Lao Dan. Chapter 723. Lao Dan, you and I are destined to be master and disciple. I would like to take you as my disciple. Are you willing to do so? Guangpu did not make any profound hints to make Lao Dan propose to be her disciple. Instead, she said it straightforwardly. First written text. Upon hearing this, Lao Dan was slightly stunned. Then, even though he had almost perfected his Taoist heart, he could not help but be overjoyed. His expression seemed to be slightly moved. He immediately bowed and kowtowed to Guangpu and said, "Your disciple, Lao Dan, pays his respect to you, master." "All right, get up. My name is Guangpu. My Taoist field is located in the Moon Palace. You'll know the details in the future." You don't have to tell me about it. Guang Pu smiled and waved her hand. An invisible force was released and lifted Lao Dan up. The force was so powerful and incredible. It was as if all the forces in the world were working together. It made Lao Dan feel as if he was facing the vastness of the universe. At this moment, he finally felt how powerful and incredible his new master was. Guang Pu smiled and said, "The method that you're cultivating is an acquired method, which is closer to the primordial spirit way. It's quite different from the Tao fruit way that I'm cultivating. I can give you two choices. The first one is to abolish your current cultivation level, and I'll teach you the Tao fruit way. The second one is to create a new method that you can use as a reference." Back then, Luo Fan was able to create countless methods for Guang Pu and the others to cultivate when he was only a third-stage Earth Immortal. Currently, Guang Pu had attained the Tai Tao fruit. Although her creative ability was far inferior to Luo Fan, it was not difficult for her to create a method that was suitable for Lao Dan's Tao fruit way. As for guiding Lao Dan to create his own cultivation method, it was extremely easy for her. That was why she dared to say such words. In fact, according to Guang Pu's thoughts before Lao Dan woke up, she would only give Lao Dan the second option. After all, even though she admired Lao Dan back then, and they were fated to meet, she only wanted to repay him. She did not have the intention to pass on Lao Dan as her successor. However, at this very moment, after witnessing that Lao Dan was able to achieve a breakthrough in his Tao heart cultivation to such a state within such a short period of time and completely see through the 96 million square meters of illusory heaven and earth, her admiration for Lao Dan had already reached its peak. Naturally, she had the thought of accepting Lao Dan as her successor. Guang Pu herself was an innate deity, and after attaining the Earth Immortal Tao fruit, she had already attained immortality. In the future, if there were no great tribulations, it would be difficult for her to die. However, even in such a situation, she didn't think that she could survive forever and never need the help of others to overcome the various tribulations she faced. Even with the existence of her master, Luo Fu, who was both her senior brother and her husband's close person, even with the existence of a son and a daughter, and even with many other men, she would never have the thought that she would be absolutely safe and never need the help of others. Under such circumstances, the existence of a successor was extremely necessary. Although the successor would inherit her own cultivation, it was not only for the sake of passing on her cultivation, but also for the sake of being able to deal with all kinds of tribulations in the future. They could help each other and overcome the tribulations together. Therefore, the successor was very important to any cultivator. It did not mean that she could not look for a successor just because it did not matter whether she could pass on her cultivation or not. Because of this, even though Guang Pu was quite confident that she could live forever, she still had the idea of looking for a successor. The successor's cultivation was almost an extension of herself. Even compared to the relationship between parents, wife, and children, the relationship was not that far apart. Only such a relationship could be relied on to overcome all kinds of tribulations. For people like Guang Pu, who had cultivated great supernatural power and was quite confident about her future, this was the significance of having a successor. For those who were quite uncertain about their future and did not know where their path was, having a successor was more important. That was, by cultivating a successor, they could try to see if the successor could embark on a new path. Finally, the successor would be able to help the cultivator and make further progress. Because of this, it was extremely important for any cultivator or any living being to find a successor to their legacy. Guang Pu was very clear about this. Since Lao Dan's Tao heart cultivation was extremely profound, he was naturally very clear about it too. Therefore, after the 3 kowtows and 9 kowtows, their relationship was completely different. After listening to the 2 options given by Guang Pu, Lao Dan pondered for a while and told her his thoughts without concealing anything. I won't give up on either of the two options. Please pass on the Dao fruit to me, and at the same time, help me create my own cultivation method. As soon as Guang Pu heard Lao Dan's words, her eyes lit up. She said with a smile, "It seems that you're very ambitious. Well, since you have this intention, I won't stop you. However, you must remember not to be too ambitious. If you can't create a suitable method for yourself, don't force yourself." "Thank you, Master," Lao Dan said joyfully. Guang Pu smiled faintly and said, "You should first build a residence nearby and settle down. After you have stabilized your Dao heart and Dao experience, come and see me again." As she spoke, she waved her hand and Lao Dan disappeared from the manor. In the blink of an eye, he arrived at the entrance of the manor. Then, she turned around and entered the wooden house at the back of the manor. Lao Dan replied as he bowed. Then, he flew up and arrived at a height of thousands of feet. After looking around, he found a small pond that was filled with rich innate vitality dozens of miles away. His eyes lit up. He activated his celestial core power and turned into a conveyance light as he flew toward the small pond. Apparently, he was planning to build a residence next to the pond. A residence was not necessarily a mountain residence. In fact, as long as it was the residence of a cultivator, it could be called a residence. In fact, it did not require any complicated actions to build a residence next to the pond. It only required some wooden houses, stone houses, or even a thatched hut. For Lao Dan, everything in the Ming realm was both familiar and strange to him at the same time. It was familiar because everything in the Ming realm was built according to the primitive world before the tribulation. He could vaguely find the shadow of the virtual world that he saw in the trial ground. On the other hand, it was strange because it was his first time seeing everything in the Ming realm with his own eyes. Naturally, it was impossible for him to not feel strange at all. However, his Dao heart cultivation was close to completion, and he could control himself almost perfectly. He knew that the most important thing at this moment was not to familiarize himself with the Ming realm, but to complete the task assigned by his master. Therefore, he landed beside the pond without any hesitation. The celestial core power in his body that was many times purer than before circulated and changed, exerting all kinds of mysterious power. He used the sand around the pond to build a simple stone house that was more than 10 square meters. This stone house looked extremely simple and crude, not much different from an ordinary house. If one had to point out something different, it would be that the structure of this stone house was rather miraculous. It could draw the rich Xiantian Yuan Qi around the pond into the stone house and increase the density of the Xiantian Yuan Qi inside. This kind of supernatural power might be a kind of mysterious supernatural power in the primitive world at this time. It was enough to amaze any cultivator. However, in the eyes of Luo Fu and the others, including Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo, it was just a small trick. Even if they had not attained the fruit of Dao and had not reached the individual immortal realm, they could still do it easily. In fact, they could do it more easily than Lao Dan. The stone house that they built would be more mysterious, and it would not only have the power to gather the innate vitality. After Lao Dan entered the stone house, he immediately sat on the futon with his legs crossed. He closed his eyes and slowly operated the celestial core power in his body. He constantly communicated with his body, his spirit, and his sea of consciousness. He tried hard to reflect on himself and constantly stabilized his Dao heart and cultivation realm at this moment. When Lao Dan listened to Guang Pu's order to establish a Dong prefecture and stabilize his Dao heart, Guang Pu's family of 4 had reunited. This person is quite extraordinary. No wonder junior sister is tempted to let him inherit her mantle. If I knew that he has such an ability, I'm afraid that I would fight with junior sister for him, Luo Fu sighed. Guang Pu naturally knew that Luo Fu was joking. She smiled and said, "Senior brother, it's too late for you to say that. Since Lao Dan has already acknowledged me as his master, he's already my disciple. I can't give him to senior brother anymore. Father, mother, aren't you praising him too much? I think he only has a firmer Tao heart. There's nothing special about him at all. Luo Gua curled her lips and said. Guer, you've underestimated your junior brother Lao Dan, Guang Pu said with a smile. Upon hearing the words, junior brother Lao Dan, Guer's eyes lit up. It was as if she had just realized that Lao Dan had become her junior brother ever since he became her mother's disciple. It's not bad to have such a junior brother, although he looks a little old. This thought flashed across Luo Gua's mind at this moment. The anticipation in her eyes became more intense. Obviously, she had already imagined what would happen when Lao Dan paid his respects to his senior sister. When Guang Pu saw the change in Gua's expression, she smiled. She deliberately pointed out that Lao Dan was Luo Gua's junior brother so that Luo Gua would not reject Lao Dan. Judging from Luo Gua's reaction, it seemed to have worked. Luo Gua had been cultivating for countless Yuan Hui. She had even held great authority when she was Princess Gua. She had seen a lot of things, but this was the first time someone had acknowledged her as a senior sister. It was a completely different feeling compared to being acknowledged as a princess by someone else. Being acknowledged as a senior sister was a feeling of having one more sister-in-law. On the other hand, being acknowledged as a princess was just a feeling of nobility. How could the two be the same? Because of this, even though Luo Gua had a lot of experience, she still looked forward to and felt happy to have Lao Dan as her junior brother. Luo Fu looked at Luo Gua's bright and expectant eyes. He and Guang Pu looked at each other and saw the smile in each other's eyes. Guang Pu did not pause for too long. She continued, Guer, you and your brother have already reached the golden immortal realm. Your supernatural power is many times stronger than Lao Dan's. However, how much have you seen through in the trial world created by your grandfather? At this moment, Lao Dan has completely seen through the entire virtual world of 96 million square meters. When Luo Gua and Luo Chunyang heard what Guang Pu said, they could not help but feel ashamed. After all, the two of them were not ordinary cultivators who had climbed to their current cultivation state from scratch. Instead, they were the so-called 3 generations of immortals who were protected by many elders who had great power. Although their cultivation foundation was solid, their Tao heart was much weaker than those ordinary cultivators who had climbed to their current cultivation state step by step. At this moment, they had only reached the 6th state of the Tao heart, which was to break through 129,600 square meters of virtual heaven and earth. They had not even reached the 7th state of the Tao heart, which was to break through the realm of true immortals and become a golden immortal. Not to mention Lao Dan, who had completely broken through 129,600 square meters of virtual heaven and earth and was almost at the edge of the 9th state of the Tao heart. Under such circumstances, even though they knew that they did not necessarily need to improve their Tao heart to break through to the next state, but could instead improve their Tao heart after breaking through to the next state, they could not help but feel a little ashamed. At that moment, be it Luo Gua who voiced out her doubts or Luo Chunyang who had yet to speak, they dared not look down on Lao Dan anymore. In fact, they even admired Lao Dan for being able to achieve this with such a low cultivation state. Alright, now that you know junior brother Lao Dan's ability, don't look down on him in the future. You must get along well with him and help each other in the future so that you can overcome all kinds of disasters in the future. Do you understand? Guang Pu said with a slightly serious expression. After hearing what Guang Pu said, Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua understood that Guang Pu was serious. They immediately nodded their heads solemnly. Seeing that the two of them knew the key to the matter, Luo Fu and Guang Pu were relieved. At that moment Luo Fu said, Alright, let's wait for your junior brother Lao Dan here. After he has stabilized his cultivation state and Tao heart, we'll start preaching to you. Hearing Luo Fu's words, Luo Gua and Luo Chunyang both revealed expressions of anticipation. The two of them were not really ignorant children, It was just that they did not hide their true feelings in front of Luo Fu and Guang Pu. Thus, they naturally knew better than anyone else how rare it was to listen to a lecture on the Tao, and they understood how great the benefits it was for them to listen to a lecture on the Tao. This was especially so when the people preaching to them this time were their parents, two supreme beings who were only a minor realm above them. When it came to discussing the Tao, the bigger the gap, the better. On the contrary, the smaller the gap between the person preaching the Tao and himself, the greater the gains after listening to the Tao. This was easy to understand. It was like teaching primary school students. The more elementary the content, the better. If you taught primary school students content that even Ph.D. students couldn't understand, how much could you expect them to learn? Even the same primary school content had to be explained using primary school method. Otherwise, primary school students wouldn't be able to learn much. It was like the equation of 1 + 1 = 2. If a mathematician explained it with a proof that he had studied for his entire life, how many primary school students would be able to understand it? From this, it could be seen that the smaller the gap between the cultivation realm of the person preaching and the cultivation realm of the person listening to the Tao, the more the person listening to the Tao would gain. Therefore, Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo, two golden immortals, would gain the most from listening to Luo Fu and Guang Pu's lectures. If Luo Fu and Guang Pu's cultivation realm was low, they wouldn't have much Tao to preach to. If their cultivation realm was high, Luo Chunyang and Guang Pu would find it harder to understand the content of the lecture because of the huge gap in their cultivation realm, and they would gain less. The reason why Luo Fan rarely preached to his disciples, apart from the fact that he needed to cultivate and did not have much time, was also because the gap between him and his disciples was too big. When Luo Fan was an individual immortal, almost all of his disciples had not attained Tao, so he was at least one realm away from them. After his disciples attained the Tao fruit of Earth Immortal, it didn't take long for him to attain the Tao fruit of Primordial Unity, but the gap was still one realm away. Now there was someone under him who had attained the Primordial Unity Tao fruit, and he had achieved the Daluo Truth Tao, but the gap between him and his men did not shrink. Instead, it increased again. It was not even a realm, but more than a realm. Under such circumstances, even if Luo Fan preached to them every day, their gains would never reach even 100 millionth of what he said. This low efficiency was not even as good as him casually giving them some cultivation tip. Naturally, he would not be able to arouse much interest in preaching to them. Regarding this difference, the disciples under Luo Fan might not understand much when their cultivation was low. They only thought that Luo Fan did not preach to them because he had other considerations. But when their cultivation realm increased to a certain level, to the point where they could just barely preach to others, they clearly understood the profoundness. They knew that it was not that Luo Fan was unwilling to preach to them, but that the gap between them and Luo Fan was too big, so big that they could not understand the Tao that Luo Fan was preaching. Because of this, Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo clearly knew how beneficial it would be for them to have their parents preach to them. Naturally, they were looking forward to it. Looking at the siblings' anticipation, Luo Fu and Guang Pu could not help but become absent-minded. Their minds were almost connected, and it was difficult to hide what they were thinking from each other. When they became absent-minded, they both discovered what the other was thinking. They looked at each other, and there was shame in their eyes. They were ashamed of the same fact, and it was that during the numerous times Luo Fan had preached the Tao, the content they'd heard and understood had actually only accounted for 1,000th or even 1,000th of what Luo Fan had said. Moreover, at that time, they'd even thought that they'd completely understood it. Now that they thought about it, they truly felt ashamed to face their master and father. They could not help but feel ashamed. Chapter 724. The time it took for Lao Dan to completely stabilize his cultivation base and realm was much shorter than what Luo Fu and the others had expected. Text first. Initially, they thought that Lao Dan would need at least 10 days to complete the process. Unexpectedly, in just 3 days, Lao Dan had completely stabilized his cultivation base and Taoist heart. Then, he transformed into a conveyance light and arrived at the manor where they were. Although Guangpu and the others were surprised, they were also very happy about it. After all, to Guangpu and Luo Fu, it meant that Lao Dan's aptitude was better than what they had expected. To Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua, the sooner Lao Dan stabilized his cultivation base and Taoist heart, the sooner they could listen to their parents preach about Taoism. After Lao Dan entered the manor, he felt that there were more majestic auras in the manor compared to the last time he was here. Every single one of these presences was thousands of times more powerful than his own. Before these presences, he was as weak as an ant. He felt as if he could die at any moment from these presences, and his soul would scatter. How can there be so many terrifying existences? Even though Lao Dan's Taoist heart was almost perfected, he could not help but be shocked. However, despite being shocked, he did not lose his composure. His Taoist heart that was almost perfected could not make him immune to the majestic auras exuded by Luo Fu and the others. However, he could still maintain his composure under the shock of the majestic auras. He would not be controlled by his instinct. Sensing the existence of a familiar aura among the majestic auras, Lao Dan directly went to the lobby where Luo Fu and the others were. After greeting Guangpu introduced Luo Fu and the others to Lao Dan and confirmed their relationship. Even if Lao Dan's Taoist heart was not close to perfected, he would still be able to recover from the reverence of the primitive world after all the recent encounters. Moreover, his Taoist heart was close to perfected, so he could feel how insignificant he was in front of Luo Fu and the others. Therefore, when he greeted Luo Fu and the others, he was extremely respectful, and he placed himself in an extremely proper position. Seeing how respectful Lao Dan was, Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo were quite satisfied. Their rejection of Lao Dan joining them out of nowhere was reduced. Now that everyone had arrived, Luo Fu and Guangpu did not want to waste any more time. They did not choose any other place and began to talk about the Tao of Tai they had comprehended in the Great Hall. As soon as he started, his aura was many times grander than when Luo Fan was preaching to them. Flowers fell from the sky and golden lotuses appeared on the ground. The entire Ming realm seemed to have become thousands of times more mysterious in an instant. The sky seemed to have become countless times brighter. All the innate vitality in the Ming realm seemed to have been loaded with some kind of wonderful power in an instant. It seemed like it could allow ordinary people to comprehend endless mysteries and obtain endless benefits by just taking a breath. Wisps of wonderful syllables seemed to be coming from the vast primitive world outside. They penetrated the barrier of time and space and entered the Ming realm, shaking all the matter and energy in the Ming realm, and even all the time and space in the Ming realm. Since the entire Ming realm had undergone such a change, the changes in the Great Hall at the center of the Tao lecture were naturally more intense. The sound that reverberated in the entire Great Hall did not seem to be coming from Luo Fu and Guangpu, but directly from the heaven and earth, the supreme Tao. Each of those syllables was in line with some kind of incredible principle and contained some kind of indescribable mystery. Just by listening to the syllables, one could already obtain unimaginable benefit. Moreover, when these syllables were connected together, the degree of mystery skyrocketed by tens of thousands of times. However, when the degree of mystery skyrocketed to such a degree, it instantly turned from nothingness into reality. The originally formless syllables transformed into all kinds of tangible light and shadows. In an instant, the scenery in the Great Hall changed. Countless unbelievable light and shadows appeared and disappeared as the syllables flashed in the void. The various vitality in the Great Hall also underwent all kinds of unbelievable changes during this process. The quality of the vitality instantly surpassed the level of innate vitality, but it was not chaotic vitality. Instead, it was of a quality similar to chaotic vitality. However, it was easier for cultivators to absorb than chaotic vitality, and it was easier for cultivators to convert into the Tao and power they cultivated. The vitality was extremely dense, almost condensing into liquid. It slowly flowed in the void like a long river, making the entire great hall seem like it was floating in the air. Under the illumination of the heavenly flower and golden lotus, the great hall seemed to have become a paradise. As the preaching of Luo Fu and Guang Pu continued, the environment of the great hall began to change gradually. The walls, floor, and roof tiles of the great hall were gradually hidden under the endless light and shadows. The few of them gradually seemed to be sitting in the chaos, watching the birth and death of heaven and earth, and waiting for the growth and decline of all living things. What they saw, what they heard, and what they thought were all the infinite truths of the Tao. This scene was many times more intense than the preaching of Luo Fan. Needless to say, Lao Dan was greatly shocked. Naturally, there were living beings preaching in the primitive world. However, the Tao that they preached was usually the Tao of immortality and the Tao of earth immortals. The Tao that they preached could at most help those who had not attained immortality to cultivate to the immortality realm of earth immortals. The mystery contained in the Tao was limited to this range. Under such circumstances, when they were preaching, they would at most make the origin chi around them denser than other places. Things like heavenly flowers falling from the sky, golden lotuses sprouting from the ground, and the sound of the great Tao were things that could only appear in myths and legends. Let alone seeing them, they could not even think about them. Among these preachers, Lao Dan was also one of them. It was precisely because of this contrast that Lao Dan was more shocked by the unusual phenomenon caused by Luo Fu and Guang Pu's preaching at the same time. That was why he felt that it was even more unbelievable. For a moment, he was completely immersed in the boundless Tao of Tai. He sensed all kinds of mysteries that he had never heard of and never thought about. He only felt that this was the most wonderful thing in the world. Luo Fu and Guang Pu were talking about how to break through the 3 stages of the earth immortal realm and attain the Tai Tao fruit in the golden immortal realm. Naturally, there were many differences between them. However, no matter what, the Tao they preached was of the same origin. It contained the most original and authentic Tao of Tai, including their lifetime of cultivation experience. These experiences were infinitely beneficial to Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo because they were already in the golden immortal realm. They were also working hard to attain the Tai Tao fruit. Under such circumstances, the Tao of Tai was like charcoal in snowy weather to them. It was so useful that it was beyond their imagination. Compared to the two of them, Lao Dan was much weaker. Although Lao Dan had unbelievably broken through some of the arrangements made by Luo Fan when he set up the trial grounds and achieved the 8 realms of Tao Heart that could only be achieved by the peak of the golden immortal realm when he was still in the true immortal realm. He was still in the true immortal realm after all. A high realm of Tao Heart could only reduce the difficulty of breaking through, but it could not make up for the gap in cultivation experience. Therefore, Lao Dan, who was only in the true immortal realm, had almost no understanding of the Tao of Tai. It was not even 1/1000th of the abstruse of Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo. He felt that the principles in front of him were almost endless, but he had gained very little. In this regard, Lao Dan's outstanding realm of Tao Heart played an important role. Under such a sense of frustration, he was still able to maintain his composure. He was still able to focus all his attention on what he saw and the abstruse Tao that he heard. He was not affected by the sense of frustration at all. He was trying his best to absorb the abstruse principles that he could understand. Luo Fu and Guang Pu were the preachers. Naturally, they had an unimaginable grasp of the state of the people who were listening to them. Seeing that Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo's eyes were constantly shining with the light of enlightenment, they were quite gratified. They preached more for the sake of their children so that they could attain the Tai Tao fruit as soon as possible. Now that they saw that the two of them had gained a lot, how could they not be gratified? They were also quite satisfied when they saw that Lao Dan did not slack off at all despite having a puzzled look on his face from time to time. The preaching continued slowly in this situation. Unwittingly, 3 years had passed. The Tai Dao was vast and infinite. Even at this moment, the Tai Dao that Luo Fu and Guang Pu had comprehended had reached an unimaginable level. If they were to preach everything, they might not be able to finish it even if they had 300 years or 3,000 years, let alone 3 years. Under such circumstances, 3 years could only be considered an extremely short period of time. However, although there were still countless Tao that could be preached, Luo Fu and Guang Pu had no choice but to stop. This was because after 3 years of listening to Lao Dan, Luo Chunyang and Luo Fu's ability to accept had reached its limit. Even if they continued to preach, they would not be able to absorb much. On the contrary, they would forget many principles and abstruse that they had obtained before due to the excessive preaching. Such a change was not worth the loss. Naturally, there was no need to continue the preaching. As for Lao Dan, he had gained less than 1/10,000th of what Luo Chunyang and Guang Pu had. What he had preached previously was enough for him to absorb. Naturally, there was no need to continue with the preaching. After the preaching stopped, the scene in the lobby did not return to normal. Instead, it still maintained the same abstruse scene as before. Even the innumerable syllables of their preaching were still reverberating in the void of the lobby. They did not disappear even though they had shut their mouth. Only the falling heavenly flowers and the golden lotuses on the ground gradually reduced as they shut their mouths. After a few breaths, they completely disappeared without a trace. The yuan qi within the large hall did not immediately disappear. Instead, it slowly scattered in all directions. Clearly, this yuan qi also followed the laws of this world. Since it had already been gathered here, the way it scattered was naturally no different from other yuan qi. There was also a process that needed to be completed in order for it to scatter into nothingness. After Luo Fu and Guang Pu stopped preaching, Luo Chunyang and Guang Pu's expressions did not change much. They were still immersed in the preaching and could not extricate themselves from it. Only Lao Dan's confusion and bewilderment had disappeared. His eyes flashed with a hint of enlightenment. The reason why he had such a change was because there were no new paths for him to accept. As a result, the principles and mysteries that reverberated in his ears were all things that he remembered and understood. Under such circumstances, he would naturally not feel confused and at a loss because he did not understand the principles that he did not understand. Luo Fu and Guang Pu looked at each other and felt that they were very satisfied with each other's mental state. Preaching was not only beneficial to the listeners, but it was also a way for the preachers to sort out their past cultivation experiences. If the number of people preaching was more than a single person, the process of preaching would also be a process of in-depth communication between them. As a result, Luo Fu and Guang Pu lectured together for 3 years. For them, it was naturally a huge gain. At this moment, they had a deeper understanding of the various principles that they had comprehended. They felt that their path forward had become much clearer than before they preached. Through this in-depth exchange of preaching, Luo Fu had a rough understanding of the various understandings of the invisible forces that Guang Pu had comprehended. He also knew that he was lacking compared to Guang Pu. On the other hand, Guang Pu's gains were no less than Luo Fu's. In this deep conversation, she also gained a deeper understanding of the various inconceivable principles that Luo Fu had obtained from the peerless Great Tao. She now knew the direction of her cultivation. How could the two of them not be satisfied with such gains? After looking at each other and smiling, they held each other's hands and disappeared from the hall with a thought. Only Luo Chunyang, Luo Guo, and Lao Dan were left sitting cross-legged in the hall, quietly comprehending the Tao of Tai left in the hall and absorbing the various gains from listening to the Tao of Tao. When Luo Fu and Guang Pu left, the three of them did not feel anything at all. At this moment, they only felt that their minds were completely immersed in the endless mysteries of the Tao. At every moment, they felt that their cultivation realm was undergoing some kind of indescribable cleansing, producing some kind of subtle improvement. Among them, the one who improved the most was not Luo Fu and Guang Pu who gained the most from the preaching. Instead, it was Lao Dan who gained less than 1/10,000th of them. After all, Lao Dan's cultivation realm was only at the realm of true immortality. He was only cultivating the acquired Dharma that was widely spread in the chaos world at this moment. Compared to Luo Fu and Luo Chunyang, his cultivation realm was tens of thousands of times weaker. Therefore, although his gains were less than 1/10,000th of Luo Chunyang and Luo Chunyang's, the proportion of the principles that he had comprehended in the past was thousands of times more than that of Luo Chunyang and Luo Chunyang. Under such circumstances, how could his improvement be less than that of Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua? As soon as Luo Fu and Guang Pu left the hall, Lao Dan's cultivation realm broke through the barrier and naturally achieved the golden immortal realm. He had become a real golden immortal. The moment he achieved the golden immortal realm, the celestial core power in his body was suddenly compressed thousands of times. It even carried an extremely pure, mysterious, and indestructible golden color. The aura of his body was also increased by thousands of times in an instant. Although the aura produced was still at the level of an ant compared to Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua, it had undergone a qualitative change compared to the state that was almost incomparable to before. The celestial core power in his body was compressed thousands of times. His body instantly became empty. Naturally, an indescribable suction force was produced, madly attracting the endless vitality in the hall. The vitality was continuously absorbed into his body, and was transformed into the celestial core power with a golden brilliance through refinement. However, although the suction force was strong, the vitality in the outside world, which was at the same level as the chaotic vitality, was purer, and of a higher level than the celestial core power in his body. Therefore, although he was absorbing the vitality at a fast speed, the amount that he absorbed was only average. In just a few breaths of time, the suction force completely disappeared, and his body became full again, without a trace of emptiness. After the celestial core power in his body was replenished, it began to circulate naturally and began to continuously refine his body. During the process, the strength of his body continued to increase. After a short while, he broke through the limit and reached a realm that was compatible with his current cultivation realm. Compared to Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua, the strength of the body in this realm was naturally as weak as tofu. However, compared to the strength of his body, it was increased by thousands of times. In the blink of an eye, the essence of Lao Dan's life had been increased by thousands of times. At the moment when all the changes in Lao Dan's body were completed, a mysterious vibration suddenly spread in the unseen world. The vibration was extremely mysterious. It seemed to have spread all over the world, the universe, and the nature of the entire chaotic world had undergone some wonderful changes. Junior sister, did you hear that? At this moment, Luo Fu, who was on another peak in the Ming realm, suddenly frowned and said to Guang Pu, I heard it. It seems that the Supreme Tao has undergone some changes. But why? Guang Pu furrowed his brows and asked. While they were talking, Luo Fu and Guang Pu thought of something at the same time. They looked at a certain location in the Ming realm, where the manor that they had just left by crossing the void was located. Their eyes were faintly shining with a mysterious brilliance. The perspective of their eyes changed. What they saw was no longer the real thing, but a world of gas. In this world of gas, where their eyes were focused, there were 3 pillars of air soaring into the sky. The 3 pillars of air were originally independent. However, when they reached the sky, they converged and turned into a magnificent clear air that filled the heaven and earth and shook the universe. How could this be? The luck of Luo Chunyang, Guer, and Lao Dan have combined together. Guang Pu exclaimed. How is it that when their karmic luck fuses together, there's such an incredible increase? This improvement is almost like becoming the protagonist of the world in an instant. Luo Fu's understanding of luck was stronger than Guang Pu's, so he was even more surprised. Chapter 725. The three pillars of Qi were none other than the three fates. Text first. In the manner, there were only three living beings: Luo Chunyang, Luo Guo, and Lao Dan. How could the three fates belong to anyone else? Naturally, they belonged to the three of them. Although the three fates were vast when they were separated, they were still within the normal range. It could be seen that the three of them were people of good fortune, but they did not exceed the limit. However, when the three strands of luck fused together, a shocking change occurred. The intensity of the fates increased by tens of thousands of times. In the blink of an eye, it broke through the limit of ordinary living beings and reached a level that even Luo Fu could not compare to when he became the protagonist of the world. It was as if the fates of the three protagonists of the world had combined. How could Luo Fu, who had worked hard for more than 100 yuan hui and even caused the destruction of the entire chaotic world, not be shocked by such a change? How could he not feel incredible? It seems that Lao Dan's fates are mysterious. Otherwise, such a change would not have happened, thought Luo Fu. With this thought in mind, his visual angle had gradually broken away from the state of observing the fates and returned to the normal visual angle. After all, he was not Luo Fan, and he did not have the supreme supernatural power of Luo Fan. However, it was impossible for him to fix his visual angle in the state of observing the fates like usual. It was already very rare for him to obtain such a visual angle for a short period of time by relying on the Tai Dao fruit that he obtained with great difficulty. When he broke away from this visual angle, he turned his head and saw that Guang Pu had already broken away from that visual angle. At this moment she was looking at him with mixed feelings. Although Guang Pu had attained the Tai Dao fruit, her cultivation was not as profound as Luo Fu's. Moreover, she had never achieved the leading role of heaven and earth, so her understanding of fate was not as profound as Luo Fu's. Therefore, she could not maintain the visual angle of fate for too long. Naturally, she left that visual angle before Luo Fu. Senior brother, can you see why their karmic luck has changed like this? Guang Pu saw that Luo Fu seemed to have understood something, so she hurriedly asked. Luo Fu shook his head and said, I don't know the exact reason, but I think it must be because Lao Dan's birth chart is special, and Chunyang and Guo just happened to meet each other. However, no matter what, this change was a good thing. Even the main character of the world would find it difficult to compare to such luck. Turning misfortune into fortune, turning misfortune into fortune, this was inevitable. It seems that no matter how reluctant we are, we can only let Chunyang, Guo, and the others go to the untainted land. That's right. Guang Pu also sighed. She did not disagree with Luo Fu's words. Their karmic luck had become so magnificent, so it obviously could not have changed out of thin air. Since there was such a change, it proved that the three of them had to bear the same responsibility. If they did not go to the untainted land, this karmic luck would definitely be worn down. In the long run, this magnificent karmic luck would be directly wasted. After the discussion, the two of them did not speak anymore. They just held hands and quietly looked at the Ming realm. Through the Ming realm, they looked at the untainted land and the vast starry sky. Since the beginning of the heaven and earth, they had been cultivating in the Ming realm without a moment of leisure. Now that their cultivation had been fixed, they finally had the time to see what the outside world looked like after the changes. Looking at it, they could not help but be amazed. They had a deeper understanding of the way of life and death, and felt that their knowledge had increased a lot. Of course, it was not so easy to increase their cultivation realm. After all, they had just broken through. In the short term, their task was to stabilize their cultivation realm. As for increasing their cultivation realm, these were tasks after stabilizing their cultivation realm. Before stabilizing their cultivation realm, even if they gained something, it would only stabilize their cultivation realm. The untainted land had naturally changed a lot compared to the desolate, untainted land before. There were countless strange creatures living in the untainted land. Many of these creatures were completely unfamiliar to Luo Fu and Guang Pu, but they could vaguely see the traces left behind by the creatures of the past. Luo Fu had once controlled the billions of living beings in the untainted land. Naturally, what he had seen and heard was unbelievably abundant. With a slight distinction, he could even tell what kind of creatures those traces belonged to, and with this distinction, he could even tell what kind of characteristics these creatures had. He could even vaguely sense the difference between the untainted land and the great tribulation of heaven and earth with this kind of knowledge. Guang Pu's perspective was different from Luo Fu's. She paid more attention to the scenery in the untainted land, observing the changes in the mountains and rivers, and feeling the supreme power that caused these changes. The two of them watched, felt, and enjoyed the peace at the same time. In the blink of an eye, 9 years had passed. The untainted land was vast and boundless. Even the untainted land before the great tribulation of heaven and earth was enough for people to look at it for tens of millions of years without rest. Moreover, the untainted land had grown more than 10 times after the great tribulation of heaven and earth. In a mere 9 years, the untainted land that Luo Fu and Guang Pu had observed was almost a drop in the ocean compared to the entire untainted land. It was not worth mentioning at all. It would not make them feel the slightest bit bored. As for the so-called tiredness, it was naturally impossible for it to happen. If two people with the Tai Lus quantity would feel tired after standing for 9 years, then the Tai Lus quantity was not worth pursuing. On this day, the eyes of Luo Fu and Guang Pu suddenly flashed at the same time. They looked at each other and smiled. "It seems that it's done," said Luo Fu with a smile. 9 years. "It's not too long, but it's not too short either," said Guang Pu with a smile. With a slight thought, the two of them disappeared from the mountain. When they reappeared, they were in the manor where they used to live, in the lobby where they used to preach. Almost as soon as they appeared, Luo Chunyang, Luo Guo, and Lao Dan, who had been sitting cross-legged in the lobby with their eyes closed for 9 years, opened their eyes almost at the same time. Absorbing the knowledge gained from listening to the great tribulation of heaven and earth was a very personal process. If one's aptitude was good, the absorption time would be longer. If one's aptitude was poor, the absorption time would naturally be much shorter. Originally, the three of them had different aptitude. Hence, it was impossible for them to absorb the knowledge and open their eyes at the same time. However, 9 years ago, when Lao Dan made a breakthrough and became a golden immortal, their luck had already merged into one, forming a gush of luck that was even more magnificent than the main character of the world. This change made the three of them experience some kind of wonderful changes. Although they had different aptitudes, this change allowed them to wake up and open their eyes at the same time. "Thank you, Master, Uncle Master," Lao Dan reacted very quickly. He immediately bowed to Luo Fu and Guang Pu. He was Guang Pu's disciple. Although Luo Fu was Guang Pu's husband, they had always addressed each other as senior brother and junior sister. Therefore, Lao Dan naturally addressed him as Uncle Master. Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo also came over and were very happy. Of course, they did not bow as solemnly as Lao Dan. Instead, they just bowed to each other like a mother and son, father and son, mother and daughter. Luo Fu and Guang Pu both smiled. In the end, it was Guang Pu who helped them up and said, "It seems that you have gained a lot. Tell me, how much have you gained?" "I seem to have reached the peak of the golden immortal realm. Although there is still a long way to go before I can obtain the Tai Dao fruit, I have reached the peak of the earth immortal Dao fruit," Luo Chunyang said happily. "Me too. From now on, my brother can no longer bully me." Luo Guo was also very happy. I have only just stabilized the golden, immortal realm. I have really let down Master and Uncle Master's painstaking efforts. Lao Dan felt very guilty. After listening to the three of them, Luo Fu and Guang Pu were very satisfied with their explanation. You were just a true immortal before this. You are already a genius to be able to stabilize the golden immortal realm. Compared to the two of them who have only reached the peak of their realm, it is hundreds or thousands of times more difficult. There is no need to feel ashamed, Guang Pu said with a smile. However, the method that you have cultivated is the acquired primordial spirit method, which is not very compatible with the Tao fruit of our sect. Since this sermon, you have also learned about the Tao fruit. What do you think? Then, Guang Pu asked again. About this I am ashamed. Lao Dan could not help but blush when he heard this. I did not know how grand the Tao fruit of Tao fruit is. I was a frog in the well and wanted to create my own method of the Tao fruit of Tao fruit. I really have no idea of the immensity of heaven and earth. Please punish me, Master. As he spoke, he knelt on the ground and did not get up. Obviously, he felt that he had no face to face his master. Lao Dan was a genius. In just a few thousand years after the great tribulation of heaven and earth in the untainted world, he was able to cultivate immortality from an ordinary living being and become a true immortal. He could even roam the untainted world and the starry sky with his own strength. Naturally, he thought highly of himself. Because of this, after going through the trial of the heaven and earth, he cultivated his Tao heart to the 8th realm and even touched the edge of the 9th realm at an unimaginable speed. Although he had a clear understanding of the power that he possessed, he knew that he was only at the level of an ant in the eyes of the ancient mighty people and that his power was only a speck of dust in the eyes of the senior masters. However, because of the perfection of his temperament, he had a kind of unimaginable confidence in himself. He thought that it was just that his foundation and the method of cultivation were not good. His aptitude was still extremely outstanding. As long as there was a chance, and as long as he understood the principle, he would naturally be able to create a cultivation method that would allow him to cultivate and even surpass the cultivation method of the ancient mighty people. Because of this, when Guang Pu asked him about his choice, he answered Guang Pu with those words. He wanted to combine Guang Pu's guidance and the method of the Tao fruit together to create a method of the Tao fruit that was suitable for his own cultivation. After listening to his words, Guang Pu could naturally see through his thoughts. However, it was not necessary to directly point out the mistakes of the disciples when teaching. It was better to let the disciples recognize their own mistakes and omissions so that the disciples could have a deeper understanding of them. This was the only way to leave a deeper impression on the disciples. Therefore, Guang Pu did not say anything at that time. Instead, she praised his mentality. This method made Lao Dan more confident. He was even more convinced that he could create a method of the Tao fruit that was most suitable for him through his own ideas. Therefore, he came to listen to the preaching of Guang Pu and Luo Fu with confidence. After listening to the preaching, he realized how shallow and ridiculous his thoughts were. The Tao fruit was unfathomable. It was all-inclusive. Almost the simplest principle was enough for a golden immortal who had never come into contact with the Tao fruit to comprehend it even after thousands of years. Based on Lao Dan's foundation, even if a cultivation method of the Tao fruit was placed in front of him, it would take him tens of millions of years to understand the abstruse part of it. If he wanted to change it into a cultivation method that was completely suitable for him, he would have to improve his cultivation realm by tens of millions of times and cultivate this method into his bone marrow to fully understand the abstruse part of it. Only then would he have a slight chance of success. After understanding this, how could Lao Dan not feel ashamed of his thoughts? Seeing that Lao Dan was so ashamed, Guang Pu just smiled and sent out an invisible force to help him up. She said, "Why are you so ashamed? Although you can't do it with your current ability, as long as you have the intention, you will be able to do it one day. Don't lose your ambition because of this. After listening to the conversation between Lao Dan and Guang Pu, Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo had a slight change in the way they looked at Lao Dan. The change was not because they despised Lao Dan for overestimating himself, but because they were curious about a novel object. There was curiosity and admiration in their eyes, but no contempt. The reason for this was because they were all extremely experienced existences, and they'd seen an unimaginable variety of cultivators. However, this was the first time they saw a cultivator with such an outstanding mentality. That was right. In their opinion, Lao Dan's mentality of wholeheartedly cultivating the method that he created and was most suitable for him was outstanding. Originally, there were no cultivation methods in the world. It was because the first batch of living beings in the world had observed the evolution of the world, observed the changes in the natural landscape, and comprehended all the changes outside of themselves. Only then did they finally create the first batch of cultivation methods in the primordial world. After countless times of development, there were all kinds of cultivation methods in the primitive world. Ordinary cultivators would pursue the exquisite methods created by their predecessors. They were even willing to do whatever it took to obtain those exquisite methods. However, they were unwilling to take the path that their predecessors had taken. They would dig out the cultivation method that was suitable for them and work hard to contribute to the prosperous cultivation civilization in the primitive world. Under such circumstances, although Lao Dan's unique mentality was slightly arrogant, it was extremely outstanding. It was not the same mentality as an ordinary person. This kind of mentality should not appear in an acquired living being. On the contrary, it was considered normal for an innate god to have such a mentality. It was precisely because of this that Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo looked at Lao Dan in such a way. Sensing the gaze of Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo, Lao Dan could not help but have a good impression of them. After all, he was ashamed of his previous thoughts. However, Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo did not despise him. On the contrary, they admired him. How could he not have a good impression of them? I will keep this in my heart and never dare to forget it, Lao Dan replied to Guang Pu solemnly. Guang Pu was quite satisfied with Lao Dan's obedient manner. With a wave of her hand, an invisible force passed through Lao Dan's sea of consciousness, leaving a densely packed text and patterns in his sea of consciousness. There were trillions of words and millions of pictures. These words and patterns almost covered all aspects of the Tao fruit that Guang Pu had comprehended, including her own understanding and the various things that Luo Fan had taught her. There were also descriptions of the essence of many other cultivation methods, including the Tao of primordial spirit, the Tao of runes, the Tao of patterns, and so on. There were even descriptions of the 5 major cultivation systems that were created by the various sects in the primitive world. These almost exhausted Guang Pu's knowledge of cultivation method. She did not hide anything from him, nor did she withhold anything from him. It could be said that after obtaining these, Lao Dan's understanding of cultivation methods was not inferior to Guang Pu at all. Guang Pu was an innate god. She was born with extraordinary self-confidence. She would never think that she might be surpassed by others if she imparted all her knowledge to others. To her, cultivation methods were just tools. More importantly, the essence of cultivation was the understanding of the Tao and the heaven and earth. Because of this, since she had accepted Lao Dan as her disciple, she no longer thought that there was any need to withhold anything from him. Instead, she directly taught Lao Dan all the cultivation methods that she knew that could be taught to him. Although Lao Dan was in the golden immortal realm, he had cultivated the acquired primordial spirit. Therefore, he could not feel the existence of the invisible force at all. He only saw his master casually waving her hand, and his sea of consciousness suddenly expanded, as if he had swallowed hundreds of millions of tons of food in an instant. He even felt that his thoughts were almost stopped because of the expansion. He felt so dizzy that he almost fell asleep. Fortunately, His Tao Heart cultivation had reached the incredible 8th realm of Tao Heart. As such, he quickly operated his mind and gradually saw what had appeared in his sea of consciousness. As soon as he saw it, he instantly felt an indescribable emotion welling up in his heart. Even with his almost perfect Tao Heart cultivation, he could not help but feel excited and almost burst into tears. Although there were trillions of words and millions of patterns, they were still in Lao Dan's sea of consciousness. Although he could not fully understand these words and patterns in an instant, he could roughly understand what was recorded in them. Chapter 726. Although the living beings at the place where the world was created did not have much of a sense of belonging, it did not mean that they would spread their cultivation methods without any scruples. Text first published. Generally speaking, for cultivators, they would not hesitate to spread other cultivation methods that they knew. However, if it involved their own cultivation methods and the foundation of their own cultivation, all living beings in the chaos world would be extremely cautious. Even if they had to pass on their own cultivation methods to others, they would definitely set up many tests. They would only pass on their own cultivation methods to others if they were absolutely sure that the person who passed on the cultivation methods to them was a trustworthy person. At this moment, his master had only met him a few times and heard him call her master. Yet, she had already passed on his most fundamental cultivation methods to him. How much trust did she have in him? How could he not be touched and shocked? Your disciple will never forget your kindness, master. Lao Dan's body trembled slightly. He kneeled on the ground and said, You don't have to be so courteous. This is all I can pass on to you. You've just broken through. There's not much benefit in cultivating in the Ming realm. Why don't you travel in the chaos world? Chunyang and Gua, you two can go with your junior brother Lao Dan, Guang Pu said with a smile. Initially, Luo Chunyang and Luo Gua thought that Guang Pu was teaching her disciple a lesson and that it had nothing to do with them. When they suddenly heard Guang Pu mention them, they could not help but be slightly stunned. After being stunned for a while, both of them had a slightly strange expression on their faces. They seemed to be looking forward to it, but also a little lost. They were looking forward to it. After all, they had never seen the chaos world after the great tribulation of heaven and earth. Naturally, they were looking forward to it when they heard that they could travel in it. On the other hand, they were at a loss because they did not think that traveling in the chaos world would bring them any benefit. They also did not know what purpose they could achieve by traveling in the chaos world. However, both of them had almost blind trust in their parents. After hearing their mother's words, they did not have any objections and immediately nodded in agreement. Although Lao Dan was a little reluctant to leave the wonderful cultivation environment in the Ming realm after the teachings of Guang Pu, he no longer had any estrangement with Guang Pu. He directly regarded Guang Pu as his most respected master. Therefore, he would not have any thoughts of disobeying her. Thus, he respectfully replied yes. All right, there is no need for cultivators to make any preparations. You can go now, said Luo Fu with a smile. As he spoke, he pointed his finger and a door appeared out of thin air in front of them. Behind this door was a silver world. Incomparably dense lunar essence gushed forth, causing everyone present to feel a chill run down their spine and their minds to clear up. Lao Dan and the other two immediately bid farewell to Luo Fu and Guang Pu. Then, they stepped into the door together. As they stepped through the door slowly became illusory and gradually disappeared without a trace, as if it had never been there. I don't know if this is really the right way. Seeing that they had left, Guang Pu could not help but sigh. She showed a rare weakness and quietly leaned on Luo Fu. Whether it's the right way or not, we have to do this. The combined luck of the three of them almost surpasses the main character of the heaven and earth. Only by traveling to more places and experiencing more things can they encounter their own opportunities. If we keep them by our side all the time, it will only harm them. Luo Fu sighed as he hugged Guang Pu. I know, but I just can't bear to. Guangpu appeared to be extremely weak as she said. Since you're reluctant, we can just pay attention to them from time to time. Anyway, with our supernatural power, it's not difficult to meet them. Luo Fu smiled. That's the only way. Guangpu had no choice but to nod. Perhaps because it was time for her to breathe a sigh of relief, Guangpu's mentality was very different from before. Even though cultivation was still important, it could no longer occupy an absolute position in her life. Instead, love and kinship were becoming more and more important to her. Because of this, she did not feel too much about Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo's departure in the past. She only felt that it was good for their cultivation, so she did it. But now, as kinship became more and more important, she began to be reluctant to let them go. She only wanted them to stay by her side. This mentality did not mean that Guangpu's Dao heart cultivation had deteriorated. Instead, it was a change in her emotions and a reversal of her understanding. Her Dao heart was still the same as before. It had almost reached the perfect ninth realm and did not degenerate at all. Her cultivation realm would not become unstable because of this mentality. Even the power of her divine ability would not be weakened because of this mentality. Meanwhile, Luo Fu's mentality had also changed. Although it was not as great as Guangpu's, it was also different from before. He also paid more attention to kinship and the people around him. If Luo Fan was paying attention to them at this moment, he would immediately know the reason for this change in mentality. The fundamental reason was that they had changed from the mentality of a junior to the mentality of a senior. In other words, because of the numerous innate gods that were of the same generation as Luo Fan in the past, there were a few 100,000 innate gods in the world that were their seniors, whereas their own cultivation realms were only barely at the middle of these innate gods. Thus, they'd always thought of themselves as weaklings, and they were juniors that needed to ceaselessly learn and advance ceaselessly in order to not fall behind. At this moment, after the great tribulation of heaven and earth, after the disappearance of the innate gods in the untainted world, after attaining the Tai fruit of Wei, and after understanding the situation in the untainted world, they finally understood their own strength. Their cultivation was almost the best in the untainted world. They also knew that their age, seniority, and status were no longer what they used to be. They had become a senior that almost no cultivator could compare to. This kind of change in identity naturally caused their mentality to change. The pressure that had always surrounded his mind and mind in the past had unknowingly disappeared. The disappearance of the pressure naturally caused a change in their mentality. It made it difficult for them to regard cultivation as the focus of their life. Naturally, they would pay more attention to kinship, love, and the people around them. This change seemed abrupt, but in fact, it was very natural. On the other hand, Guangpu directly taught Lao Dan all the cultivation methods that she knew, including the one that she was cultivating at the moment. It was because of this change in her mentality. Of course, it was not because she liked Lao Dan very much, but because she had the bearing of a teacher and had the self-awareness of being a senior. Because of the bearing of a teacher, she understood that the reason why she could be a teacher was not because she knew more cultivation methods than her disciples, but because she had a deeper understanding of the Great Way and the heaven and earth than her disciples. The self-awareness of being a senior gave her absolute confidence. She was confident that her judgment of people would not be wrong, and she was confident that her disciples would not be inhuman. Not to mention how reluctant Guangpu and Luo Fu were to leave Luo Chunyang, Luo Guo, and the others. At this moment, the three of them had appeared at the entrance of the Moon Palace and were standing on the moon. It was a boundless starry sky. There was an infinite void above and below them. When they looked into the distance, they could see a boundless land in front of them. The land was obviously hundreds of millions of miles away from where they were. However, when they looked at it, the three of them felt that the entire land was pressing down on them. That was the chaos world. The reason why the Chaos World was in front of them was that they were standing on the moon, which was parallel to the Chaos World. They turned their heads and looked around. The dark starry sky was dotted with stars, but each star seemed to be slightly illusory. Although the stars were shining mysteriously, the three of them knew that the stars were still not complete and were constantly condensing. Junior brother Lao Dan, you're more familiar with the Chaos World. Where do you think we should go now? Luo Chunyang looked around and asked Lao Dan, who was beside him. Senior brother, although the untainted land is generally peaceful, there are still many disputes in various places. If we're going to travel, we'd better avoid those disputed places first. The Green Continent is the most peaceful continent among the 9 continents. Why don't we go to the Central Continent? Lao Dan said respectfully. Senior brother, although the untainted land is generally peaceful, there are still many disputes in various places. The 9 continents? Aren't there 1,296 continents in the Chaos World? Could it be that the living beings in the Chaos World have divided them into 9 continents? Luo Guo was slightly stunned and asked in surprise. That's not the case, senior sister. Although there are many continents in the Chaos World, each continent is vast and boundless. With the current ability of the living beings in the Chaos World, they can only explore and contact the 9 continents near the center. That's why it's called the 9 continents, Lao Dan explained. Luo Guo heaved a sigh of relief and said with a smile, Oh, I see. I knew it. The untainted land was so vast in the past, and only grandfather had the ability to divide it into 129,600 regions. Now that the cultivation world of the untainted land has declined, how could it be possible to divide the 1,296 continents into 9 continents? About this, junior brother, I've been wondering about it. I've counted again just now. There are only 1,295 continents in the Chaos World. Why do you keep saying that there are 1,296 continents? Lao Dan frowned and asked respectfully. When Luo Guo heard this, she counted and couldn't help but cry out in surprise. Oh, it seems to be true. Everyone, where did the last continent go? They were on the moon, hundreds of millions of miles away from the Chaos World. Therefore, they could barely see the shapes of the continents in the Chaos World. Even though it was very blurry and difficult to reach those exact locations, it was still not a problem to determine the number of continents. Therefore, the three of them could count how many continents there were in the Great Wasteland at any time. When Luo Guo first spoke, she did not count the number of continents in detail. She only confirmed the number of continents according to the information she got from Luo Fan, Luo Fu, and Guang Pu. Now that she heard Lao Dan's question, she was surprised. After counting carefully, there were only 1,295 continents. The continent in the northwest where Buzhou Mountain was located had disappeared. It was as if there had never been a continent there. How could she not be surprised? How could she not feel that it was unimaginable? Luo Chunyang frowned when he heard Luo Guo's words. After carefully examining it, he nodded his head and said, Indeed, a continent has disappeared. How could this be? Luo Guo was obviously not satisfied with Luo Chunyang's answer and shouted, How would I know? We've never been separated from each other all these years. If you don't know, I naturally don't know, Luo Fu said helplessly. Oh, it seems to be true. Luo Guo thought about it and nodded. It seemed to make sense. However, I think there must be some important secrets hidden in the disappearance of the continent. If we can find out the truth, we will definitely have a deeper understanding of the Chaos World, Luo Chunyang continued. Ah, I see. Why don't we go to the original location of the continent instead of going to Qingzhou? Luo Guo's eyes lit up and said, What do you think, junior brother Lao Dan? Luo Fu did not answer Luo Guo's question but asked Lao Dan. Lao Dan asked, Where is the original location of the continent? It's at the end of the northwest. Luo Guo smiled and pointed to the northwest. That's a little far. With our flying speed, I'm afraid it will take us hundreds of thousands of years to reach that place without any rest. Lao Dan thought for a while and said in surprise. Of course, Lao Dan's ability could not directly measure how far it was from their current location to the extreme northwest, and how long it would take for them to fly there. The reason why he could roughly measure how long it would take for them to reach the place that Luo Guo was pointing to was based on his understanding of the Jiuzhou continent and the time needed to cross the Jiuzhou continent to reach the extreme northwest. The amount of calculation involved was extremely huge. It would take a long time for the supercomputers of the future generations to calculate it. However, for a golden immortal like Lao Dan, even if he had cultivated the heaven primordial spirit cultivation method, it was a problem that could be solved with a single thought. Therefore, he was able to calculate it after a little thought. It took Lao Dan only a few thousand years to reach the golden immortal realm from the moment he stepped into Tao to the current cultivation level of the golden immortal realm. Under such circumstances, hundreds of thousands of years was an extremely long distance for him. It was enough to make him want to retreat. It was not because his Tao heart was not cultivated enough or his temperament was not perfect enough. It was because he felt that this method was not very efficient. It was better to choose another method. Hundreds of thousands of years? It's just a few periods. Since there's nothing else to do, let's do it this way. Luo Chunyang pondered for a while, and felt that the time was not too long. He immediately made the decision. This was the difference in the concept of time. The Daluo dynasty that was established by Luo Fu took more than 100 periods to defeat the demon race. Luo Chunyang participated in the whole process. His concept of time had long become different from ordinary cultivators because of this process. Hundreds of thousands of years was really not too long for him. Yes, it's only hundreds of thousands of years. It's not too long, Luoguo said with a smile. Luoguo's concept of time was not much different from Luo Chunyang's. She also did not feel that hundreds of thousands of years was too long. After listening to their words, Lao Dan suddenly felt an indescribable sense of frustration. He felt that he was so insignificant in front of his senior brothers and senior sisters. If hundreds of thousands of years is not too long, then wouldn't the course of my life of more than 5,000 years be just a blink of an eye? This was the only thought that lingered in Lao Dan's mind. However, what else could he say? Moreover, if it was not for the fact that he felt that there was nothing else he wanted to do in the chaotic world, why would he fly to the starry sky, come to the moon, and finally have this opportunity today? From this point of view, the decision made by Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo was not unacceptable to him. Therefore, he nodded and said, "Since senior brothers and senior sisters already have a goal, let's make a decision." "Then what are we waiting for? Let's set off quickly," Luo Guo said happily. Luo Chunyang also nodded. His body shook, and he turned into a ray of pure sunlight and rushed up. Following his movement, Luo Guo did not fall behind. She turned into a rainbow and rushed up. Both of them had achieved the golden immortal realm by cultivating the Tao fruit. The power of their supernatural power was more than tens of thousands of times stronger than Lao Dan, who cultivated the acquired primordial spirit. When they were out of the moon, Lao Dan turned into a rainbow and left the ground. "Junior brother, your speed is too slow. Why don't you let me bring you along?" Luo Guo paused in the void. When Lao Dan came to her side, she said with a smile. Luo Guo was frank and straightforward. Although what she said made Lao Dan feel embarrassed, there was not a trace of sarcasm in her words. Lao Dan did not feel any resistance when he heard what she said. Moreover, with his temperament, he would not care even if Luo Guo was being sarcastic. Therefore, he said with guilt, "If that's the case, thank you, senior sister." Hearing Lao Dan's words, Luo Guo chuckled. She turned into a rainbow and wrapped Lao Dan in it. Her speed increased tremendously, and she caught up with Luo Chunyang, who was in front of her. Together with Luo Chunyang, they flew toward the chaotic world at an unimaginable speed. Without Lao Dan holding them back, the two of them fully exerted the supreme speed of cultivating the Tao fruit to the golden immortal realm. In just a few minutes, they flew across the distance that took Lao Dan several years to fly. They passed through the gap between the chaotic world and the starry sky, and entered the chaotic world. Chapter 727. At this time, there were a total of 1,296 continents in the untainted land. Even if the continent where Buzhou Mountain was hidden in another spacetime rhythm was excluded, there were still 1,295 continents. Text first. Every single one of these continents was nearly boundless. For the living beings in the untainted land, even if all of them gathered on a continent, they would only occupy a small area of the continent. Under such circumstances, the 9 continents near the center could be linked together to form the 9-continent continent. This was already due to the incredible means left before the great tribulation of heaven and earth. Therefore, although there were many living beings in the untainted land at this time, there were no traces of intelligent living beings in most areas. The entire untainted land was still very primitive. The place where Luo Chunyang, Luo Guo, and Lao Dan landed was the continent closest to the northwest of the 9-continent continent, the Qin continent. At this moment, this was the continent where the moon was facing. It was also the continent closest to the moon in the untainted land. It was also the last place where Lao Dan landed before he headed to the starry sky. The reason why he chose to land here was that it was closest to the moon. The starry sky at this time seemed to be no different from the endless starry sky before the great tribulation of heaven and earth. When one looked up, the sky was still full of stars dotting the pitch-black void. However, in fact, there was an essential difference between the two. They had completely different characteristics. If it was the endless starry sky before the great tribulation of heaven and earth, one would appear at the same place in the endless starry sky after passing through the astral wind, thunder, and fire layers no matter where one started in the untainted land. The distance from any of the stars in the sky would not be different depending on the starting point. The reason was that the endless starry sky actually belonged to another spacetime. Although it was attached to the untainted land, it also had some characteristics of another spacetime. However, the starry sky at this moment was not like this at all. The relationship between the starry sky and the untainted land at this time was not the relationship between two spacetimes, but the relationship between the top and bottom. In other words, when one looked at the starry sky from the untainted land, the starry sky seen from different positions would be completely different. When they headed to the starry sky from different positions, the distance between them and the stars would also be different. The reason for this was not difficult to understand. After all, the primordial world was so vast and practically boundless. Compared to it, any star was only an extremely tiny dot in the primordial world. Under such circumstances, the stars that were spread out in the primordial world naturally could not occupy the main body. They could only become embellishments in the primordial world. The stars that were embellished in each area were obviously not exactly the same. Naturally, there would be a difference. Of course, the sun and the moon were the two most important stars in the starry sky. Their positions were fundamentally different from other stars. If the starry sky was complete, the positions of the sun and the moon had to be paid attention to. The different positions of the sun and the moon would not affect the distance between them as much as other stars. However, at this time, only 365 of the stars in the sky were complete. The other stars were only condensed from the essence of the stars. How could the stars in the sky be considered complete? Naturally, the positions of the sun and the moon could not accurately reach the positions that they had to stay at. Therefore, the difference between the positions of the moon and the untainted land between the 9-continent continents appeared. The reason why Luo Chunyang and the other two did not choose to fly directly in the northwest direction in the starry sky and land on the continent that had disappeared was because the distance between flying in the starry sky and walking in the untainted land was not too far apart. If they really flew in the starry sky, it would also take hundreds of thousands of years to reach the continent. Obviously, the boredom of flying in the starry sky was countless times better than walking in the untainted land. There was no need to think about how to choose. When they landed on the Qing province continent, they saw large areas of primordial forests, high mountains, plains, grasslands, and gobi. Although the area that they could see was full of vitality, there were not many traces of intelligent creatures. Only the roars of beasts and the wails of morning could be heard by the three of them. Senior brother and senior sister, the Qing province continent is far away from the center of the 9 continents. Therefore, not many cultivators are active here. That's why it looks so primitive, Lao Dan said when he saw Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo's expressions. He knew that they were sighing with emotion. It's really very different from the past. Luo Chunyang sighed. I haven't been here before, but I remember that there used to be a large city ruins here. Our dynasty and the people of the demon clan often came here to exchange information. But now I can't find any traces of it. Time has really changed. Luo Guo sighed with emotion, which was rare for her. Before the great tribulation of heaven and earth, this continent was an area close to the center of the untainted land. It was also the place where the main forces of the human race and the demon race came into contact. Therefore, this continent was the place where wars broke out the most frequently. At the same time, it was also the place where the human race and the demon race understood each other and exchanged information the most frequently. Although the battles between the human race and the demon race were the mainstream, no matter how deep the hatred was, it could not stop the drive of interest. Therefore, the two parties would definitely communicate and trade. The city ruins was created under this background. It was a city for the human race and the demon race to communicate and trade. Of course, the city ruins that originally existed here was not the only city ruins in the entire untainted land. It was also not the largest city ruins. However, it was a relatively special city after all. Therefore, it had left an impression in the memory of Princess Guo of the Daluo dynasty. After the great tribulation of heaven and earth, various terrains of the untainted land had changed. However, there were still traces of the original city ruins. As soon as Luo Guo arrived here, she naturally thought of the city ruins. Therefore, she sighed with emotion. When Lao Dan saw that Luo Guo was looking at a place that was tens of thousands of miles away in the south, he knew that the city ruins was probably there. He said, "Anyway, we're not in a hurry now. Why don't we go to the city ruins and see if there are any ruins left?" Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo were naturally indifferent. They immediately nodded and agreed to Lao Dan's suggestion. Since they had reached a consensus, the three of them turned into long rainbows and flew toward the city ruins that was tens of thousands of miles away. In the blink of an eye, they had already arrived at that location. If they did not know that there was a city ruins in this location before the Great Tribulation, they would just think that this location was a relatively flat plain. However, when they looked at this place again, they could see the traces of countless buildings left at this location. The terrain was faintly undulating, the depressions that faintly divided the plain into rather regular areas, and the regular distribution of various plants all indicated that there were traces of human activity in this place a long time ago. The three of them did not come here just to take a look at this place from afar. Therefore, they did not float in the void. Instead, they directly landed at the center of the city ruins, which was originally the core of the entire city ruins. It's a pity. Although there are some traces left, it has been greatly deformed, Luo Chunyang sighed. Yes, it seems to have been expanded by 10 times. There are faults everywhere. If we don't look for it by force, I'm afraid we won't be able to find it, Luo Guo also sighed. The changes in the untainted land were not just the fact that a piece of land was divided into 1,296 continents. It was also magnified by 10 times. Under such circumstances, the terrain of each area was naturally magnified by 10 times. However, it was impossible for the man-made buildings to be magnified by 10 times. Therefore, there were faults everywhere in the city ruins, and it was impossible to restore them. So it has been magnified by 10 times. I thought that the city ruins would be so huge. I was almost shocked. Lao Dan could not help but laugh when he heard that. This was not a lie. The city ruins occupied an area of tens of thousands of miles. The area of such a city was almost unimaginably huge to Lao Dan. Compared to it, the cities that existed in the untainted land that were hundreds of miles or even thousands of miles were just like small villages. How could he not be amazed? When he heard that the city ruins had been magnified by 10 times, he finally let out a sigh of relief. Although a city of thousands of miles was still dozens of times larger than the cities that existed in the untainted land at this time, it was much better than the previous city of tens of thousands of miles. This is just a small city that was built temporarily for the purpose of trading. Although it was left behind because of the changes in the situation, it was almost a city in the past. The cities that we built back then were 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, and even 10,000 times bigger than this. If you're already shocked by this, won't you be paralyzed when you see other ruins? Luogua laughed. After all, she was not a weak woman who would grieve over the coming of spring. After sighing with emotion, her mood had returned to normal. According to the legend, there was an extremely prosperous civilization before the great tribulation of heaven and earth. However, only a few words were passed down. The truth is not known. It seems that senior brother and senior sister are very familiar with that period of history. I wonder if you can tell me about it, Lao Dan said with a smile. So you don't know? Luo Guo was surprised when she heard that. It's only been 1 or 2 yuanhui. Many cultivators survived the great tribulation of heaven and earth. Why don't you know anything about that period of history? Luo Chunyang was also quite puzzled. Lao Dan could not help but smile bitterly when he heard that. He said, "Senior brother and senior sister, although there were many seniors who went through the great tribulation, they regarded that period of history as a taboo. It's fine to ask them for questions or to ask them for Dharma spells. However, if you want to ask about that period of history, you'll never get an answer. Although there are some words about that period of history in the untainted land now, it's only spread by those seniors who accidentally let it slip. How can anyone understand the real history?" I see. Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo were suddenly enlightened. They looked at each other and saw the look in each other's eyes. They did not know whether to laugh or cry. Finally, Luo Chunyang sighed and said, "It seems that when they saw the scene in the untainted land now, they thought that the untainted land was destroyed. Feeling guilty, they were unwilling to pass down that period of history and continue the hatred in the past." Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo were only juniors under Luo Fan. However, they were still powerful beings in the golden immortal realm. Even before the great tribulation of heaven and earth, they were still the most powerful beings in the untainted land. They were invincible in the untainted land at this time. With such divine power, how could they be ordinary? Although Lao Dan only said a few words, they had a complete understanding of the mentality of the living beings who survived the Great Tribulation based on the situation in the past and the scene in the untainted land now. They knew why they regarded that period of history as a taboo. When Lao Dan heard Luo Chunyang's words and looked at their expressions, he could not help but be shocked and said, "Could it be that the untainted land has already been destroyed?" From what senior brother said, could it be that there's something mysterious about this? Haha, junior brother Lao Dan, do you also think that the untainted land has been destroyed? Luo Guo laughed. Is that not the case? Judging from the places in the trial grounds, the cultivation environment in the untainted land is tens of thousands of times worse than before. The sky is gloomy, the earth is broken, and even the heavenly pillar seems to have been broken. Isn't it destroyed? Lao Dan said in surprise. Lao Dan looked like an old man, but in terms of age and cultivation, he was far inferior to Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo. He was also far less knowledgeable than them. Therefore, he put himself in a very low position and did not feel embarrassed to ask them for advice. Ha ha! Junior brother Lao Dan, you've really misunderstood. What you've said is not a sign that the untainted land has been destroyed. The cultivation environment in the untainted land is worse than before. That's because the Qi of heaven and earth has evolved from the original innate Qi to the acquired Qi of heaven and earth. It's a process from instability to stability. Although it's more difficult to cultivate, it's the growth of the untainted land, Luo Chunyang said with a smile. Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo were the grandchildren of Luo Fan. Their innate foundation was extremely strong. Therefore, their knowledge was naturally not comparable to that of ordinary cultivators. They might not be able to fully grasp the essence of the evolution of Qi, but they had a general understanding of the situation. Naturally, they understood that the transformation of the chaotic Qi into the innate Qi and the transformation of the innate Qi into the acquired Qi of heaven and earth meant that the Qi of heaven and earth had become stable. It was the inevitable growth of the heaven and earth, not a regression. Upon hearing this, Lao Dan's eyes brightened up. Rays of wisdom kept flashing in his mind and consciousness. Instability has turned into stability. So this is the mystery of Qi, Lao Dan murmured. A look of enlightenment flashed across his face. Lao Dan was a living creature born in the untainted land after the great tribulation of heaven and earth. He was a living creature that was between the innate Qi and the acquired Qi. Since he started cultivating, he had received the teachings of the senior masters and obtained countless treasures for his cultivation. He had also traveled in the untainted land for thousands of years. He had accumulated countless experiences. Of course, he had gained a lot. At the same time, it had also allowed him to inherit the cognition that the living creatures in the untainted land were accustomed to. For ordinary living creatures, they only felt that the more advanced and perfect a heaven and earth was, the more suitable it would be for cultivators to cultivate. The Qi of heaven and earth should also be of a higher level, and the easier it would be for the living creatures to absorb, the more beneficial it would be to the living creatures. In this way, the untainted land would live up to its name of being advanced and perfect. Therefore, the quality of the Qi in the untainted land was worse than before the great tribulation of heaven and earth. It was more difficult for the cultivators to absorb it, and it was more difficult for the cultivators to cultivate. Naturally, they regarded this as a sign that the untainted land was degenerating and becoming less perfect. Since Lao Dan had inherited this cognition, he naturally thought so too. He even regarded it as common sense. At this moment, Luo Chunyang's words had directly shattered his cognition and opened another door to a wider heaven and earth in front of his deep-rooted concept. The heaven and earth did not exist specifically for living creatures or cultivators. The heaven and earth existed for its own existence. All living creatures were just appendages attached to the heaven and earth. They were incomparably important to them, but they were dispensable to the heaven and earth. Therefore, in order for the heaven and earth to grow and become perfect, it was impossible for all living creatures to be the protagonist. Naturally, it was impossible for the heaven and earth to change in a certain direction just to make it easier for the living creatures to cultivate. The changes needed by any heaven and earth were changes that would allow it to exist for a longer time. Only such changes could be considered as changes that could be considered as growth. Obviously, only stability could allow the heaven and earth to exist for a longer time. Only then could the heaven and earth be less likely to be destroyed by certain changes. From this point of view, the innate Qi of heaven and earth was in a state that was extremely easy to degenerate, be absorbed by living creatures, and be consumed easily. It was obviously not suitable for the existence of a perfect heaven and earth. Only by becoming more stable and turning into a state that was less easily absorbed and consumed by living creatures, Could the innate chi of heaven and earth be considered as the growth of the heaven and earth? Therefore, when the innate chi of heaven and earth turned into the acquired chi of heaven and earth, it was naturally the growth of the heaven and earth. It was a kind of positive change. As soon as this idea was formed, Lao Dan suddenly felt that the layers of fog that covered his eyes in the past seemed to have dissipated a lot. Countless ideas that he thought were correct in the past suddenly showed countless omissions and contradictions at this moment. An indescribable joy filled his heart and mind. In a trance, he even felt that his cultivation realm had made great progress. His primordial spirit and celestial core power had become much purer and condensed than before. Junior brother Lao Dan is indeed a genius. No wonder you can cultivate to the golden immortal realm in just a few thousand years. Luo Chunyang could not help but exclaim in admiration when he saw the changes in Lao Dan. It's a pity that junior brother Lao Dan has cultivated the acquired primordial spirit. If he could cultivate the Tao fruit like us, the power of his supernatural power would not be so weak, Luo Guo lamented. Chapter 728. While speaking, Lao Dan had regained his senses. The divine light in his eyes became clearer and purer than before, as if many of the impurities in his eyes had been completely removed. It was as if his entire soul had undergone a baptism, and his vision was no longer the same as before. Words first, Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo looked at Lao Dan and could not help but admire him. Thank you, senior brother and senior sister. I understand now. Lao Dan bowed to Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo. There's no need to be so courteous between brothers. Junior brother Lao Dan, do you still have any doubts about whether the primitive world has been destroyed? Luo Chunyang smiled. I already believe that the primordial world has not been destroyed. After the Great Tribulation, it is more perfect than before the Great Tribulation. However, I'm still a little puzzled by the various performances. Senior brother, please explain, said the old turtle. Oh, is it because the sky is dark, the earth is broken, and the heavenly pillars are broken? Luo Chunyang asked. Yes. That was what Lao Dan was puzzled about. Although he knew that the primitive world must not have been destroyed by the battle during the Great Tribulation, he still could not understand the reasons other than the vitality. Since he did not understand why there were such phenomena, he naturally had to clarify it. It's not difficult to understand. The Great Tribulation of the heaven and earth has only passed for about 10,000 years, which is less than 1/10 of a period. Naturally, it's a transitional process. Look at the stars in the sky. Don't they look illusory? In the future, when the stars in the sky become completely real, the sun and the moon will return to the right track, and the sky will not be dark anymore. As for the destruction of the heavenly pillars in Buzhou Mountain, it's even simpler. It's because the primitive world has stabilized to the extent that it no longer needs the support of the heavenly pillars. Thus, the heavenly pillars have naturally been destroyed, Luo Chunyang said with a smile. His explanation made Lao Dan come to a sudden realization. Also, the earth seems to be broken into more than 1,000 continents, but the overall area is 10 times larger than before. How is it considered destroyed? Luo Guo, who was at the side, interrupted. Obviously, she had a deep understanding of the changes in the earth. At this moment, all the doubts in Lao Dan's mind were gone. He felt that the world had become better than ever. An indescribable sense of security rose from his heart, and endless hope seemed to be right in front of him. Being in the wreckage of a world that had been destroyed and being in a thriving world that was constantly growing was naturally completely different. In the past, Lao Dan thought that the heaven and earth had been destroyed and was heading towards destruction. Even Lao Dan felt depressed from time to time. He was vaguely worried that the heaven and earth would suddenly collapse with a loud bang, causing all living beings to perish along with it. This kind of pressure might not mean anything normally, but when he entered the deepest state of cultivation, he would naturally be disturbed, making him unable to wholeheartedly improve his cultivation, unable to devote himself to cultivation. With such a mentality, it was naturally impossible for him to unleash all of his cultivation potential and thus affect his cultivation achievements. At this very moment, Lao Dan understood that the world was flourishing and was moving towards a more glorious and perfect state. The pressure that was vaguely appearing in Lao Dan's heart finally disappeared completely. At that moment, the feeling was almost comparable to an incredible breakthrough in the cultivation realm. I see. It seems that all living beings' understanding of the heaven and earth has a huge deviation in the past 10,000 years. It's really amazing. Lao Dan let out a long sigh. At this moment, Luo Guo suddenly raised her eyebrows, and a meaningful smile appeared on her face. Almost at the same time as Luo Guo, Luo Chunyang's expression also changed slightly. He turned his head and looked somewhere in the void. After Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo's expressions changed for a while, Lao Dan also sensed something. His expression also changed slightly, and he looked at the void that Luo Chunyang was looking at. The void was about 100,000 miles away from here. The distance was extremely far for ordinary people, but for cultivators like Luo Chunyang and the others who had achieved a high cultivation realm, it was only a short distance away. Seeing that Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo did not say anything, Lao Dan knew that they had let him handle the matter. He shouted softly and said, "May I know your name? Why did you come here to eavesdrop on our conversation?" His voice was gentle, but it was filled with a sense of awe. It traveled across the distance of 100,000 miles and blasted into the void. Long ears and an old face. You're indeed the true immortal Lao Dan. However, I didn't expect that the legendary true immortal Lao Dan has already cultivated to the level of a golden immortal. You've hidden it so well. At this moment, a hoarse voice came from the void. Then, the void fluctuated slightly, and a throne that was about 100 feet high broke through the void and appeared in that position. The high platform was made of stone, but no one knew what kind of stone it was made of. It looked extremely ancient and mysterious. It also emitted an ancient and desolate aura, as if it had walked out from the ancient myths and legends. There was a middle-aged man sitting on the throne. The man had a well-built body and a cold expression. The aura that radiated from his body was like a surging tide. Powerful ripples of energy surged through the surrounding space, causing ripples to form in the space. You're able to break through the chaotic void. It seems that you have at least the cultivation of a golden immortal. May I know your name? Lao Dan did not care that he was recognized by the man. Instead, he asked. His voice was still unhurried, showing a sense of calmness. When the middle-aged man heard Lao Dan's question, he chuckled and said, "I'm just a nobody. It doesn't matter what my name is. If you want to address me, you can call me Domain Dragon." Domain Dragon? Are you from the ruins of this city? I remember that this city was called Domain Dragon City. Luo Guo raised her head and said with a smile. So it's you guys. I didn't expect that after the tribulation of the humans and demons, the higher-ups of the Chunyang Crown Prince and Princess Guo who triggered the tribulation are still alive. When the middle-aged man heard Luo Guo's words, his facial expression changed drastically. The aura around him surged in all directions, causing more and more space ripples to appear in the surrounding void. After hearing what he said, Lao Dan came to a sudden realization. He no longer had any doubts about the man's identity. This man was obviously a creature who survived the tribulation of the world. He might be from the human race or the demon race. Besides, he should have a close relationship with Domain Dragon City. He might even have survived in Domain Dragon City. That was why he called himself Domain Dragon. Judging from his attitude toward Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo at this time, it was obvious that he also thought that the chaotic world had been destroyed by the war between the humans and the demons. He was extremely dissatisfied and even resentful. Luo Fu was the emperor of Tianhuang of the Daluo dynasty. Luo Chunyang was his only son, so he was naturally the crown prince. Therefore, Luo Chunyang was respectfully called Crown Prince Chunyang in the Daluo dynasty. Luo Guo was the only daughter of Luo Fu, so she was called Princess Guo. Only the creatures before the tribulation would know such a title. The middle-aged man stood up from the throne. His expression changed. He seemed to be angry, happy, resentful, and dead. It was so complicated that no words could describe what he was feeling at this time. Now that the Daluo dynasty no longer exists, there's no need to mention the titles Crown Prince Chunyang and Princess Guo. We're just ordinary cultivators now. Luo Chunyang sighed. He understood what this man was thinking. Regardless of whether this man was from the human race or the demon race, in his opinion, the destruction of the world was caused by the battle between the higher-ups of the human race and the demon race. To him, the two higher-ups of the human race were the main culprits of the destruction of the world. It might be an exaggeration to say that he wanted to kill them, but he did not want to welcome them. There was a soft swoosh. The middle-aged man's throne took him across a distance of 100,000 miles in an instant. He appeared directly in front of Luo Fu and the others. They were less than 1,000 feet away. At this place, the aura emitted by the throne was tens of thousands of times clearer than when it was 100,000 miles away. The three of them could clearly feel the powerful power condensed in the throne. As for the middle-aged man, he was able to see the three of them even more clearly, recognizing every single detail of their bodies. How dare you say these words so casually? Are you really so cold-blooded and heartless? The middle-aged man stood on the throne and looked down at Luo Chunyang and the others. He gritted his teeth. As he spoke, the power in his body trembled. A thunderous sound rang out from his body, shaking the space around him. It caused the Yuan Qi within a radius of tens of thousands of kilometers to violently riot. It was as if the entire space was enraged along with his rage. Sensing the power of this man, Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo were convinced that this man was from the human race. Moreover, he was a golden immortal from the human race who had cultivated the innate weapon cultivation method to the golden immortal realm. His power was hundreds of times more powerful than Lao Dan's. Of course, even if his power was 100 times more powerful than Lao Dan's, he was still just an ant in front of Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo. The two of them could even crush him into pieces with one finger. Even so, Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo were not interested in this at all. Even if the middle-aged man who called himself Domain Dragon spoke rudely to them and looked down on them in such a condescending manner, they did not have any thoughts of crushing him. After all, although they did not feel guilty, they also knew the reason why this man was feeling. They could understand his actions, so they did not take it seriously. There are some things that you don't know, so I won't blame you for being disrespectful to me, Luo Chunyang said calmly. The middle-aged man almost exploded when he saw Luo Chunyang's lack of guilt. However, for some reason, he did not attack Luo Chunyang. Instead, he roared and said, "I don't care what the secret behind this is. I only know that in that great war, there are only tens of thousands of humans left in the entire untainted land. I only know that the once prosperous untainted land has returned to its primitive state. All the creatures that I am familiar with are gone. I only know that the entire land has been broken into thousands of pieces. I only know that the endless pneuma between heaven and earth has been consumed and degraded into the acquired pneuma today. No matter what the reason is, even if there is a big reason, I will never think that you are innocent." As the middle-aged man roared, a dark cloud suddenly appeared in the sky. In an instant, the heaven and earth within a radius of 10,000 miles became even darker. Only the light emitted from his body made him look like an angry god. Luo Chunyang frowned and waved his hand. The dark cloud dissipated and the world became bright again. The light emitted by the middle-aged man was no longer conspicuous. It was like a faint fluorescent light. After dispersing it, he raised his hand and clenched it lightly. The middle-aged man felt an endless pressure pressing down on him from all directions, causing him to feel his entire body shrinking rapidly. In the blink of an eye, he was about to turn into minced meat. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, his body suddenly became light. That pressure disappeared completely, as if it had never appeared. He looked around and found that his line of sight was dozens of feet lower than before. The distance between him and Prince Chunyang and Princess Gua had also shrunk to a few feet. With a thought, he found that the throne under him had disappeared and returned to his body. He was now directly facing Prince Chunyang and Princess Gua. He couldn't help but be horrified by this discovery. It was not that he had lost the support of his soul after losing the throne, that he had become extremely timid and insecure, but from the moment his throne disappeared, he found that his strength was as insignificant as an ant in front of the pure Yang Crown Prince. The pure Yang Crown Prince only needed to raise his hand and he could make his weapon lose its function. Under such circumstances, even if he exhausted all his strength, it would not have the slightest effect on the pure Yang Crown Prince. This was the source of his horror. In an instant, the middle-aged man felt like his heart had died. He felt like his life had collapsed and he no longer had any meaning. I exhausted everything I had to cultivate to become a gold immortal by chance. I didn't expect them to play with everything in the world like a chess piece and easily cultivate a divine ability that's 10,000 times stronger than mine. Where is the justice? This was the only thought that echoed in the man's mind. That's right. Although he had treated Luo Chunyang and the others as the culprits who had caused the destruction of the world and the extinction of all living beings, the truth was that he did not think that he was clean. Thus, he did not seek out Luo Chunyang and the others to take revenge and fight them to the death. That was why he did not fight Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo when he discovered them. It was just that he was unwilling to acknowledge their identities as the Crown Prince and Princess. However, the fact that he did not have any thoughts of seeking revenge against them did not mean that he was willing to be weaker than them. The truth was the exact opposite. Because he didn't have the right to seek revenge, he had an obsession in his heart. A belief that their actions were wrong and that they would not have a good ending. Because of this obsession, he didn't want his cultivation to be weaker than Luo Chunyang and Luo Guo. Because of this belief, he almost collapsed when he found out that Luo Chunyang's divine ability was so much stronger than his. Luo Chunyang cultivated the Tao of fruits and had reached the peak of golden immortal. It was impossible for him not to have some pride. Therefore, although he could understand the middle-aged man's feelings, he was unwilling to raise his head and talk to the middle-aged man. That was why he pushed the middle-aged man's throne back into his body, making it so that it could no longer appear in the outside world. Now, he saw the middle-aged man suddenly become so dejected after the throne disappeared. He couldn't help but frown. The middle-aged man's emotions were so complicated. No matter how much Luo Chunyang understood the human heart, how could he see the reason why the middle-aged man became so dejected? Although he didn't think the middle-aged man became a coward after losing the protection of the throne, he still thought that the man's cultivation of the Tao heart was extremely lacking. This was different from the impression he gave Luo Chunyang before. Naturally, Luo Chunyang was disappointed. However, he didn't have much relationship with the middle-aged man, so he didn't care too much about him. He said, "You'll know the truth in the future. It's useless to talk about it now." As he spoke, he felt that it was meaningless to stay here. He said to Luo Guo and Lao Dan, "Let's go." As soon as he finished speaking, he immediately turned into a rainbow and flew toward the northwest direction. Luo Guo looked at the middle-aged man and sighed. However, she did not say anything. With a sway of her figure, she turned into a streak of light and followed Luo Chunyang. This time, she didn't bring Lao Dan along. Luo Chunyang's speed was not very fast. Lao Dan could catch up with him, so she didn't need to bring him along. "You Qiu Dao, you can't just look at the surface of things. There's still a long way to go. What happens in the future may change your mind, Lao Dan said to the middle-aged man. Then, he turned into a rainbow and chased after Luo Guo and Luo Chunyang. Based on Lao Dan's original identity, Yu Qiu was naturally his senior, an existence that he needed to pay homage to. However, at this moment, he had been accepted as a disciple by Guangpu. Even though he didn't think that his identity was any higher than before, it was inappropriate for him to face these seniors and masters like before. He had to take Guangpu's face into consideration. If he still paid homage to them like before, how would Guangpu keep her face? Therefore, he had no choice but to pay homage to them 1,000 times more than before. Lao Dan's words were like a bolt of lightning that woke the middle-aged man up from his daze. He raised his hand and tried to grab Lao Dan. However, his strength was scattered, so he couldn't grab Lao Dan in time. He could only ask anxiously, "What do you mean? Are all the clansmen still alive?" His words spread far away, but he didn't get any answer. When he collected the scattered strength and flew into the sky, he found that he had completely lost track of Luo Chunyang and the others. It was as if they had never appeared before. "Hey, what's going on? Answer me!" The middle-aged man yelled at the sky. His voice rolled like thunder, shocking the living beings within a radius of millions of miles.